You're good to go.
I would like to call the Committee of the Whole meeting of February the 28th, 2022 to order. Good evening, everyone. My name is Tony Brunet, Councillor and Chair of the Planning and Economic Development Committee. We are meeting electronically through Zoom during this declared emergency period. Members of the public may observe the proceedings by accessing the live webcast at our YouTube channel. I will ask our Deputy Clerk to complete a roll call of council so that we can confirm quorum. Devan, please go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. Mayor Easton?
Present.
Councillor Rajima?
Here.
Councillor Russell?
Here.
Councillor Brunet?
Here.
Councillor Pachariva?
Present.
Councillor and Deputy Mayor McPherson?
Here.
Councillor Mickleth?
Here.
Councillor Timmers?
Here.
And Councillor Reimer.
Here.
Thank you. We have quorum, Chair.
In addition, I want to take a moment to welcome the staff we have joining us today electronically. Chief Administrative Officer Mike Kirkopoulos, Director of Finance, Administration and Innovation Lawrence Wagner, Director of Legislative Services Town Clerk Julie Kirkolos, Director of Special Projects Kathleen Dale, Director of Planning and Development Matt Bruder, Manager of Planning and Development Monica Coquiera, Associate Director of Recreation and Culture Sarah Ain, Cultural Development Coordinator Jessica Wilson, Director of Economic Development and Communications Paul Deaney, Director of Public Works Dave Graham, Associate Director of Public Works Jillian Harris, Legislative Committee Coordinator Deanna Phillips, and moderating and clerking the meeting today, we have our Manager of Legislative Services, Deputy Clerk Devan Kripp. IT staff are in attendance. Also in attendance, we have Gregory Bender, Director of Urban and Community Planning, WSP Global Inc. Angela Zao, Project Manager, WSP Global Inc. Ethan Lamont, Upper Canada Consultants. John Greer, Niagara SPCA and Humane Society. Martin Leclerc, Angela Little, David Jacobs, Johar Singh, Byron Dodd, and Jeff King. As this is a virtual meeting, I will ask that we follow some procedures during this electronic meeting. Should there be a connection or service disruption for the chair, or if quorum is lost, the chair and our deputy clerk will call a 10-minute recess to reconnect and to regain quorum. If quorum is lost, the meeting will be adjourned. If connection is lost from the chair, the deputy clerk will ask those in attendance to wait up to 10 minutes to provide the chair time to reconnect and resume the meeting. Otherwise, after that time frame, Vice Chair Michalak will resume the meeting until the chair has reconnected and resumes their role. Each member of council who wishes to speak, please raise the hand feature on your video call, and the deputy clerk will track our speakers list today and then invite you to speak when I open it up for questions or comments. Also, when I finish reading a motion and announcing the mover, the deputy clerk will then call out the vote by reading each member of council's name out loud. Please remember to take yourselves off mute during this portion of the meeting so you can confirm if you support or oppose. Also, when not speaking, please remember to put yourselves on mute. Declarations of interest. Are there any declarations of interest? I'm not seeing any, Deputy Clerk.
Seeing none.
Thank you. Moving on to the confirmation of agenda. Do any members have any amendments to the order of agenda? Again, I'm not seeing anything, Deputy Clerk. Thank you.
Neither.
So we'll move to item number 5, statutory public meetings. We have 2 statutory public meetings this evening. The purpose of the 2 public meetings is to receive documents from the public and consider questions regarding a draft comprehensive zoning bylaw by the town of Lincoln, and the other being a zoning bylaw amendment by Coles Florist, Inc. for 4766 Bartlett Road North. We will consider the staff report associated with each item immediately after each statutory public meeting. Section 1715 and 3412 of the Planning Act requires that before adopting an official plan amendment and before passing a zoning bylaw amendment, council must ensure that sufficient information and material is available to understand generally the proposal being considered, and council must hold at least one public meeting for the purpose of giving the public an opportunity to make representations regarding the proposed amendments. If a person or public body does not make oral submissions at a public meeting or make written submissions to the town of Lincoln before the amendments are approved, the person or public body is not entitled to appeal the decision of the town of Lincoln to the Ontario Land Tribunal, OLT. Personal information is collected under the authority of the Planning Act and may be contained in an appendix to a staff report published in the meeting agenda, delegation list, and or the minutes of the public meeting, and made part of the public record. The town of Lincoln collects this information in order to make informed decisions on the relevant issues and to notify interested parties of council's decisions. It may be used to serve notice of an Ontario Land Tribunal hearing. Names and addresses contained in submitted correspondence and other information will be available to the public unless the individual expressly requests the town to remove their personal information. The disclosure of this information is governed by the Municipal Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Act. Our first public meeting is for the purpose of the draft comprehensive zoning bylaw by the town of Lincoln, PD 11-22. Prior to proceeding with delegations, Gregory Bender, WSP Global Inc. will be providing an overview of the draft comprehensive zoning bylaw. After we have received the presentation, we will then hear our delegations. I will ask that members of council hold their questions of the consultant and the staff until after we have received the delegations. Prior to proceeding with the presentation from Gregory Bender, WSB Global, I will ask the council proceed with a majority vote. Sorry, I got ahead of myself there, Deputy Clerk.
Don't you correct to call the vote for majority vote to extend the presentation?
Yes, sorry. Prior to proceeding with the presentation from Gregory Bender, WSP, I will ask the council proceed with a majority vote to extend the speaking time. I have the motion moved by Councillor Pachariva. The council extends the presentation time until completed. I will now ask our deputy clerk to call out the vote.
Thank you. And Councillor Deputy Mayor McPherson?
Yes.
Councillor Micklick?
Yes.
Councillor Reimer?
Yes.
Councillor Timmers?
Yes.
Mayor Easton?
Support.
Councillor Rajima?
Yes.
Councillor Russell?
Yes.
Councillor Pachariva?
Yes.
And Chair.
Yes.
Thank you. That carries.
Thank you. I will now ask our Director of Planning and Development to provide introductory comments. Mr. Bruder.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I believe you all were already introduced to Mr. Bender from WSP, who's been helping us on this project, a very important one to update our comprehensive zoning bylaw for the town of Lincoln. We're happy to be at this point now. We've had multiple open houses with residents and agencies, and now we're at the point for the first time where we have an actual complete draft zoning bylaw. And we want to take tonight as an opportunity to highlight key aspects of the project and obtain council input on the draft document. So this is really, the first time that the full comprehensive draft document has been available and is before council. So as such, there's no decisions to be made tonight. This is a public meeting. Really, the intention is for staff to listen to input provided. And there also remains plenty of opportunity, plenty of time for additional collaboration with stakeholders as necessary. And that would obviously happen before we come back with any finalized document. And that finalized document will consider comments received. There are still some comments yet to be received. We still are waiting for a few from certain town departments and agencies. The consultation is ongoing. So I just wanted to set the context in that regard. But at this point, I will turn it over to Mr. Bender to take you through the first part. Thanks. Greg, go ahead.
Thanks, Matt. Mr. Chair, members of committee and council, it's my pleasure to be here tonight. Matt's right. This is our sort of first major formal opportunity to present you with the draft zoning bylaw. It's we're sort of culminating with a number of consultation exercises that we've conducted over the extent of the project. Obviously, this project has changed since the beginning of it, which happened about 3 years ago. Or 2 years ago. So, you know, it is sort of an opportunity for all of yourselves to ask any particular questions, provide any feedback, and also members of the public to provide any feedback on the document in terms of any clarifications they might need or perhaps any concerns that they might have. So if I could have the slide advance, please. So again, I'm sure you're all very familiar with the zoning bylaw project and your current zoning bylaw, but just for context, the intent of the process was to review your current zoning bylaw and replace it. Your current zoning bylaw is 9314Z1. And the focus of this exercise was primarily to conform to your existing official plan, which has changed since several times actually since your zoning bylaw was updated, and also to conform to recent policy, provincial policy and legislation. It's also an opportunity to examine specific issues in more detail, issues that have been brought up through the process that we've been asked to consider through this in terms of implementing the zoning bylaw. Some of the other things that we've been asked to do is obviously update definitions, ensuring requirements are contemporary, also trying to improve the zoning bylaw's clarity. As much as we can, the zoning bylaw is a very technical document, but we have tried to do that, and I'll talk to you a little bit about that in the upcoming slides. For those of members of the public that perhaps are unaware, a zoning bylaw is a document that implements the official plan. The official plan provides sort of general land use and development policies on how the town's to grow over time. And the zoning bylaw really states sort of how land may be used, where buildings or structures could be located, types of buildings that are permitted, and also lot sizes. We call them performance standards. So lot sizes, dimensions, parking requirements, associated building heights, and also potential setbacks from the street. Really, the zoning bylaw is as I mentioned, a legal document and helps manage land use and development, is an opportunity and provides some clarity in terms of protecting conflicting, potentially hazardous land uses in the town. And also zoning bylaws are subject to change. Again, that there's a whole process under Section 34 of the Planning Act that allows for a zoning bylaw to be updated, because as much as we can try and capture everything, zoning bylaws, as well as many planning documents, do evolve over time, and there's a process associated with that. Next slide, please. So the work program was undertaken through 3 phases. Stage 1 is really background research, bylaw review. Stage 2 is a summary report and draft zoning bylaw. And stage 3, which is where we are right now, is really the bylaw refinement and final sort of enactment of that. In stage 1, we prepared a communications and consultation strategy, a draft discussion paper, really to identify all the issues that we needed to be looking at, as well as in how we might be addressing them through the development of the bylaw. We had a committee meeting, stakeholder consultation, as well as a public open house. And then we sort of summarized all that in a final discussion paper. In stage 2, we had the summary report. We had a committee meeting. We prepared the draft zoning bylaw, and again, another open house, which was done a few months ago. And again, where we are right now is we took the feedback received, we revised the draft zoning bylaw. We're currently at our statutory public meeting. And again, as Matt mentioned, the whole intent of this is to receive feedback, and we'll consider that and look to update the document as needed. I will also, as a caveat, because the zoning bylaws are so technical in nature, it's very rare to get them perfectly right the first time. So that's why we need to go through these exercises to ensure that we get feedback, and so we can address that in the next version of the zoning bylaw, which we intend to complete as one of the next stages in this particular phase. And then we're looking for council adoption really late spring 2022. Next slide, please. So to provide a bit of an overview of what your existing zoning bylaw looks like, it was adopted by Town Council in February of 1993 and approved by the OMB at the time in October of 95. So as I mentioned, there's been a number of provincial policies, legislation, even locally in the region and as well as the town that have changed since 1995. Even some of the provincial matters that we should identify and will identify are examples are accessory residential units, even on-farm diversified or agricultural regulations. Those have changed significantly since 95, and I'll talk to you a little bit more about that in upcoming slides. There was also an opportunity to look at the number of zones that you have, and you have a total of 19 that does not include holding zones or sort of site-specific exceptions. And those 19 zones are divided into 6 general zone categories, as you can see. And the zone categories are really agriculture, residential, commercial, industrial, institutional, and open space. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, one of the major tasks that we undertook was to conform to your existing official plan and sort of other sort of provincial legislation. So we've organized this into major sort of conformity areas, and I'll walk you through this really quickly. So again, we had to obviously conform to the official plan land use designation. So what we did is we overlaid the official plan schedules onto your zoning maps and then determined where there might be some refinements needed based on what the official plan designates certain lands. So we had to correct minor issues related to that overlay that we undertook. We also had to ensure that we were responsive to the form and function of lands within the town as contemplated by your official plan. And also to, as I mentioned before, sort of reflect contemporary zoning tools and approaches. And again, the way that we've done that is to just update some of the terminology, some of the definitions, and even use additional graphics to help explain certain definitions or provisions. In terms of build form, we've got setbacks in keeping with latest development trends and guiding height and transition adjacent to established or low-rise neighborhoods. As I mentioned, we've updated the definitions, and we also are conforming with a recent official plan amendment that was approved in September 2020 related to cannabis uses. And again, so we've done that and also incorporated those into the zoning bylaw. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, some of the more substantial provincial policy changes have really occurred in agriculture. And so we look to conform to those in the zoning bylaw by providing a bit more direction, clarity, flexibility in line with your official plan as it relates to agriculture related uses, agritourism, and on-farm diversified uses. So where in the agricultural zone where agriculture is a permitted use, the zoning bylaw will permit appropriate uses and establish those provisions for ag-related uses, agritourism, and on-farm diversified uses. Again, all ensuring that we are in keeping with provincial guidelines. So just for context, agriculture-related uses include farm-related commercial, farm-related industrial uses, and these uses are really tied to the primary use of the land as a farm or an agricultural use. The intent is to support agriculture and to benefit from being really in close proximity to those farm operations. The whole intent is that there's flexibility to ensure that the area is well served without, say, having to relocate in another area of the town that might not actually benefit that particular area. Agritourism includes farm-related tourism uses, including limited accommodation like a bed and breakfast as an example. And the intent is that we promote the enjoyment, education, and activities related to that farm operation. And on-farm diversified uses include really, again, uses that are secondary to that principal agricultural use. Again, the intent is, is always that it's going to be an agricultural use, but allows for owners of the agricultural use or farmers to try and diversify the use to allow for them to really support the use of the lands and try to make ends meet. That includes home-based businesses, agritourism again, and other uses that produce value-added agricultural products, including but not necessarily limited to winery, brewery, and a distillery. All of these uses will be subject to the general provisions. General provisions in the zoning bylaw are sort of, as they might suggest, very general, but also apply to the entire town, not so much necessarily specific to a particular zone. We've also updated, we'll just call them housing regulations to allow, as I mentioned before, sort of secondary residential units or accessory residential units, which are to be permitted in all residential zones, which was identified as part of changes to the Planning Act and provincial policy. Next slide, please. Other official plan conformity and policy issues I wanted to address tonight is the removal of outdated zone categories. So removal of the state residential zone, prestige industrial zone, and the recreational commercial zone. And these have all been addressed through either other zones or site-specific regulations. For those who attended or heard about the open house that we had a few months ago, there was some concern about the removal of the R2 zone. The intent around that was to allow for flexibility in the R1 zone or the RM1 zone. And that was to allow for sort of additional residential units in a particular area that are often very, very difficult to accommodate without having to go through a rezoning, which again, when there's many sort of proposals for that, there's significant opposition. So we tried to consider that through the consolidation of zones. And again, we did hear a significant amount of concerns related to that. So we did revert back to your existing zone structure by having sort of two primary residential zones, an R1 zone and an R2 zone. We introduced new zones to better represent intended use of lands. And again, just to conform to the official plan. Those include the office commercial zone, which provides for commercial uses as well as opportunities for sort of denser forms of employment. This primarily relates to the GO Transit secondary plan, which we'll talk a little bit about in a few slides. There's a mixed use zone which provides for a transition between existing residential neighborhoods and the central business district. And then there's the another mixed use zone, which is the central business district zone, which provides for sort of a mix of commercial, institutional, residential uses in your downtown. As I also mentioned before, we looked to update sort of the overall format and function of the zoning bylaw. And that was done to really allow for it to be a little bit easier to read and more user-friendly. And this was done, or one of the ways that this was done is by adding diagrams and illustrations. So again, if you have a definition, you may have an associated diagram next to it, just try and help explain that. Again, it's just to help with clarity. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, one of the opportunities that it was to conform to your official plan and any secondary plans. And again, one of the secondary plans that I was just mentioning was the GO Transit Station secondary plan from 2018. Just as a note for secondary plans, they are the primary locations that the town is to focus efforts in terms of accommodating growth, which is mandated by the province. And the new zoning bylaw will implement secondary plan policies into the zoning bylaw to ensure that there's a creation of diverse, mixed use, walkable neighborhoods that make efficient use of lands within your urban area. So as I mentioned, in the Beamsville GO Transit Station secondary plan, we are proposing an office commercial zone. And again, that's really just to coincide with what you see here and the boundaries of the secondary plan, just to provide, again, for mixed use commercial uses, as well as opportunities for higher density forms of employment to support the ridership in the area. Next slide, please. And related to the Prudence secondary plan, which was adopted in 2018, I'm going to turn this over to Matt just to provide a bit more context on this one.
Yeah, thanks, Greg. So this is an important one to highlight as well. We were undergoing a similar exercise pertaining to this piece of property and updating the zoning based on the secondary plan as well, and making sure all the maps and everything are consolidated. During that process, there continued to be ongoing dialogue with the property owner, as there has been ever since the secondary plan was developed and finalized back in 2018. As everybody knows, this, along with the GO secondary plan area, constitute the vast majority of vacant land within Town of Lincoln urban boundaries, which is really considered ideal to accommodate growth in principle. And this comes down through a lot of provincial policy direction that a lot of you have been hearing so much about. And further to that, there's been even some more related recommendations coming down from the province in terms of more efficient use of urban lands, especially vacant lands, accommodating more compact built forms, and looking at meeting minimum growth targets, which again we'll probably speak about a little bit later, as there's another report regarding the regional official plan updates coming a little later on. So with our review of this zoning bylaw ongoing, and considering the overall build out for this site will be more than likely a number of years, there was really an opportunity to review the proposed development and look to build in some flexibility to accommodate a more compact built form, more particularly in the eastern side, and more generally broaden the range of housing options. Like I say, there has been ongoing discussions, not only with the property owner, but also with the town, with our legal representation too, on how best to do that, how best to streamline the process, again, in concert with a lot of provincial direction to try to streamline process as much as possible. That said, you know, I really do think there's an opportunity, and I mentioned this initially, to move forward with some more consultation efforts as we move past today, including some targeted additional consultation specific to this particular piece here. So we will be moving forward with some of that as next steps. So if I could get the next slide, please. So I'll get into what some of the proposed updates are, but really before I do that, I just wanted to draw everyone's attention to the actual text that's in there, labeling it as conceptual only. This is really considered a concept to articulate where the land use changes or the updates could be incorporated. It's still subject to a detailed design process that hasn't been initiated yet, and that could likely lead to further refinement, including things like the exact number of units. There's still some subject to change, but really it's just meant as a visual to try to look at some potential updates to accommodate that more compact built form where it makes sense. But I also, you know, when I say that we're going to be accommodating that build form or providing that flexibility, it's important to note too that this is not just a necessarily carte blanche permission for more density and or height. What it really is we're building in the flexibility, but it's subject to some holding provisions that we're including as well. And those would be specific to things like servicing, traffic, and then looking at other urban design issues such as shadow impacts, wind impacts, things like that, to again make sure that yes, while we're building in the potential through this zoning bylaw update, there still is an opportunity to revisit and refine, and again, making sure, you know, that we're crossing all our T's and dotting our I's as we move forward. So just going into just a couple of the changes. I think it's also important, I'll go over the ones really that are specific to what would be included in this zoning update, and then you'll see some other ones in here that I can quickly highlight, that there might be some changes from a previous concept that was also just conceptual, but again, there was already existing land use permissions for those. So I think it's important to differentiate the two. Just going through some of the changes that would be considered as part of zoning, you'll notice now there are some singles proposed along the waterfront promenade on the western edge, north of the promenade. Those weren't there before, those are proposed. It's an opportunity to increase the stock of the single detached dwellings over and above what was there. Again, trying to add to that overall housing stock. If you shift your attention to the blue area, that was the employment block. You'll see now that the buildings have been separated, one for better exposure at the northwest quadrant of the roundabout, where it was located before within the cluster of the other buildings with the large amount of surface parking. So that's been changed, and now there has been some proposed inclusion of some back-to-back townhouses in that area. The park and open space area. So this is something where there's been a little bit of back and forth in recognition that there is a large amount of green space, definitely for passive uses along the entire waterfront, that will be retained, along with the valley lands to the east and the stormwater management block to the west. All those are in place in terms of open green space. The active space, in order to accommodate things like you know, a higher amount of potential parkland dedication to cover things like programming, the multi-use trail along the waterfront, the potential for shoreline protection in front of the park that will be needed. There was dialogue that led to a little bit of a refined park boundary in terms of the actual active space that you see there in the lighter green. But, you know, it's important to note when you look at it from a pedestrian perspective, you know, you won't be able to really see the differentiation between what's active and what's passive. It still will remain to be a full open space area along the waterfront that's over 5 hectares in size collectively, not including those valley lands or the stormwater management block. So there still will be a significant portion along there. So I felt it was important to note that. If you shift your attention just to the west of kind of the purple there, the mixed use in Main Street, that kind of magenta color in the middle. To the west of that, there was a portion, there was kind of a realigning of a road, and there was a portion there that was included as mixed use as well. There is now some additional residential built in there. It affects part of a couple of townhouse blocks and some singles. And then the area for flexibility to accommodate the bulk of potential additional density would be to the east of that Main Street area, that area that's, I guess you'd call it kind of a, I don't know, what is it, a darker pink or something like that, just above, or just to the right of the other magenta, the eastern magenta area there. That's where, there was always envisioned to be, more higher density residential. There's been some additional requests in terms of some provisional height and density there. So that is something that we're working into specific for the holding provisions. Again, there will be servicing solutions that will need to be articulated. Those solutions will be at the developer's cost. But again, we've included holding provisions to make sure that these things are factored in before any additional zoning permissions are provided. So there still is that level of control moving forward. Now, just some other things I wanted to point out just generally. I know that there's some other changes that it looks like, what it looks like in here. For instance, where some of the townhouses are identified there on the west side, right adjacent to the adjacent property, which is Victoria Shores. It looks like there's some addition of some towns. Though that's a situation where there was always permission for either land use. Usually when you have zoning provisions on a property, there's a range. It's not very often you find just one particular use. There's a couple provided. So that didn't require any zoning changes there. And the same is true on the east side of that street there. I believe it's Street B, which leads me to another point. You notice some of the road networks have shifted a little, some of the local roads and the private lanes. Again, this is some flexibility that was built into the secondary plan, knowing that there would be further design refinements and technical studies that would refine the geometrics of some of these roads. And those studies continue into detailed design. But again, there is some flexibility, not necessarily things that are added into the zoning updates. And finally, I think generally speaking, one could make an observation that yes, there's, it looks like there's more units in here, there's less parking identified, but ultimately it's important to understand there's been no relief sought for any of these zoning areas in terms of parking relief, setbacks, lot coverage, anything like that. There still needs to be compliance with those regulations in those zones. So again, this being shown as a concept, there certainly is subject to additional change, but it's more just trying to get the general land use updates and some provisional flexibility for some height and density moving forward. So those are my comments with this, and I believe now I will be turning it back over to Greg for the rest of the presentation.
Thanks, Matt. And next slide, please. So in terms of some of the additional updates that we made in the zoning bylaw, I'll sort of walk you through some of the parking and driveway regulations. And we also undertook a bit of a side assignment related to residential parking requirements. So I'll walk you through a little bit about related to what we did in the sort of the subsequent slides. But we also introduced bicycle parking requirements. And this was actually based on some of the stakeholder consultation that we had. And we were asked to consider that through sort of some of the work that we were doing, including requiring minimum bicycle parking spaces, dimensions, and location of bicycle parking facilities or structures in particular zones where that makes sense. We also introduced reduced parking rates for shared parking, and I can sort of tell you a little bit about this in a bit more detail, sort of in mixed use developments based on potential for shared parking according with the different types of uses that might be there. So as an example, where you have an office and a clinic, generally speaking, those particular uses are not busy as you move into the evening or overnight. And there's a number of reasons for that because there's just nobody there working. So generally speaking, where we're indicating if there's 100, that's 100% of the occupancy rate of that use in that particular time. And again, where we see other uses, if they were to be sort of on the same lot or in the general area of those residential uses, an example, generally speaking, will be busier in the evening hours. So This just allows for some flexibility on how parking can be accommodated in a mixed use area, just to ensure you don't have vacant parking lots sitting there overnight. It allows for that sharing of uses depending on the parking need. So again, just for context, what you would do is calculate the required parking spaces for each use, multiply the number of parking spaces required by that occupancy rate that I just mentioned. And for each time period, you add the parking space calculations for all of the uses, and then you get that cumulative total, and that the largest total of all the uses in any time period is the number of spaces required. So for instance, as you have 100% and say you have another use, you would just add those two together, getting the total parking requirement during that time of day. Again, we did this based on sort of best practices across the province, and we've sort of done this in other municipalities with some decent level of success. It does take a little bit of getting used to, but again, this is really just for mixed use developments where you've got sort of appropriate uses that would have different parking requirements at different times of the day. Next slide, please. So just to tell you a little bit more about the sort of the detailed residential parking requirement review that we did. So again, the intent was to determine appropriate resident and visitor parking requirements specific to the town. And again, what we did was we looked at relevant policy direction. We looked at local vehicle ownership rates from a survey done in 2016. Again, you can't find any recent surveys because of the pandemic. So again, one of the suggestions is that the town take another look at this when another survey is prepared. But again, 2016 will give you a pretty good idea of where the town sits. We looked at parking requirements in other municipalities, again, as part of a best practices. And we also looked at historical parking reductions in the town, sort of again, where someone might be seeking reductions through a minor variance or rezoning. So the review of vehicle ownership and parking requirements, we did a best practices review, and we looked at 14 other municipalities, again, looking at many of the municipalities within the region and also outside of the region, including Caledon, Milton, Kitchener as an example, and so on. Next slide, please. So the town's transportation objectives emphasize promoting non-auto modes and reducing car dependence. Again, in your official plan, there's various policies that suggest that the town is looking to reduce car dependence, support active transportation, promote municipal and interregional transit, promote GO transit, and to efficiently use existing and planned infrastructure. Your transportation master plan provides a high quality connected active transportation network and also promotes transit service to and within the town to reduce, again, car dependent travels where that's an opportunity. The Transportation Master Plan also introduces a transportation demand management policy to encourage non-single occupant vehicle travel in peak hours. As a note, excessive parking supply can encourage auto use. So again, if the parking lots are very large or there's lots of parking, people will always drive. And to support multimodal transportation objectives, lower parking requirements may be considered to avoid oversupply. Again, where that makes sense, obviously. Next slide, please. So vehicle ownership is a strong indicator of sort of parking demand that includes visitor parking. And vehicle ownership rates in the town are actually quite consistent with other municipalities, certainly not the highest nor the lowest. So what we looked at is detached houses, a townhouse, and an apartment. So in the town, you've got about, say, just over 2 vehicles per household. In the townhouse, about 1.5, and an apartment just under 1. And again, you'll see the ranges provided in some of the other municipalities. And again, the town is sort of well within the ranges, and in each case, certainly not the highest or lowest. And setting parking requirements below local vehicle ownership can actually prevent oversupply. However, visitor parking demand will still need to be considered. Again, it's something that is quite important to understand how parking will be accommodated. Next slide, please. So parking requirements in the town are actually, as I mentioned, within range of other municipalities. Again, so for a single town and apartment, the town's requirements are 2, 2, and 1.25. And other municipalities range, so from 1 to 2 for a single detached, 1 to 2.25 for a townhouse, and 1 to 1.8. Again, certainly well within those ranges. Most municipalities do require 1 space per unit for a single detached. For a townhouse, most municipalities require parking at a rate below their local vehicle ownership rate. And again, it's because generally speaking, the intent is that you want to try and minimize the parking requirements for townhouses, because again, townhouses are quite a lot smaller than, say, a single. In terms of apartment, some municipalities actually specify resident and visitor parking ratios in their zoning bylaws, and the most common visitor parking requirement is about 0.25 spaces per unit. Next slide, please. So site-specific zoning provisions provide precedence in the town, and that those, as I mentioned, is some of the research that we did in the town to understand sort of where some of those needs were. And again, so they've been looking for lower parking requirements for townhouses and also specifying resident and visitor parking ratios for both townhouses and apartments. So what we did is we looked at, again, this is how it's impacted the town. And so for a single or semi-detached, the base parking requirement is 2 spaces per unit. Site-specific parking requirement sort of space has been found. We weren't able to find anything. There's no parking requirement, and then the reference, the sort of zoning bylaw special provision also said there's not applicable any parking requirements. For a townhouse, the base parking requirement is 2. The site-specific parking requirements that we found were 1 unit, which was around 1 parking space, and then 1.25 for residential and 0.3 for visitor, which equals about 1.55. And again, those can be found in sort of the RM zones in Heritage Village and then also Prudence land in the RM133 zone. And for the apartment land use, the base parking requirement is 1.25. And again, we found some ranges as it relates to how that could be applied. So 1.25 and then plus 1/4 visitor space would equal 1.5 spaces. That's that's in the Prudence Landing RM2, and you can see that RM2, 15, 16, and 17. And also 1 residential unit plus 1/4 visitor is about 1.25, which we found in the Prudence GC 18 and GC 22 zone. Next slide, please. So parking management strategies, they actually should be considered to optimize the use of on-site parking and neighborhood on-street parking. And again, so the issue relates to using the garage for storage and how that actually impacts the ability to accommodate parking on site. It also impacts the ability to accommodate parking related to visitors as well. And again, this is not only related to the town. We found this across the province, again, where you've got a garage. Many people don't always use that for a parking space, but the intent is that it is very much for a parking space. That's how parking minimums are identified and considered as for a garage. So some municipalities have looked at strategies on how to get people to start using their garages for parking of their vehicles. And some of the strategies include cleaning your garage campaign in coordination with, say, garbage collection, where it allows people to clean their garbages out and make room for their vehicles. One of the other issues relates to neighborhood on-street parking, and that it really should be serving local visitors, but can also be taken up by residents or nearby non-residential users. Again, residents where, for instance, if they have their garage not available to accommodate their vehicle. And one of the strategies to help with this includes setting appropriate on-street parking time limits and considering increased parking enforcement in critical areas where this is an issue. Also can consider amendment to the parking bylaw pertaining to parking in proximity to entrances, again, which will allow for those sort of non-residential users to avoid parking in that area. Next slide, please. So in terms of some of the potential draft parking requirements, we looked at, again, detached residential dwellings as well as townhouses and apartments. So your existing requirement for a single detached dwelling is 2. And we're actually looking at maintaining that. And the rationale is because your ownership rate is actually over 2 vehicles per household. So it doesn't actually make sense to lower that. It is still within range of other municipalities, and there's no historic request for any parking reductions related to a single detached dwelling. For townhouses, your existing parking requirement is 2 spaces per unit, and we're actually looking at reducing that to 1.5. Again, vehicle ownership rate is about 1.67. So again, it's not a significant stretch to have that at 1.5. It is within mid-range of other municipalities, and there are precedents of parking reduction related to this in the town. And in terms of apartments, your current parking space requirement is 1.25. You don't have visitor parking requirements, so that's why we're looking at reducing that to 1 space per unit, which is quite common. And it actually is right in line with your ownership rate of just under 1 vehicle per household. And we're also looking at having a 1/4 space requirement for visitor parking. Again, this is based on best practices and certainly something that we've discussed with staff as being sort of important to consider for apartment uses. Next slide, please. Not intending to go through all of this again. This was just meant to provide you with a summary of what we found and where the town sits in terms of everyone else that we looked at. And again, as I mentioned, the town is quite in line with the range of what we found in other municipalities. Certainly not the highest and certainly not the lowest. And again, the intent is that, where if there was an extreme on one side or the other, that would certainly inform our recommendations. But again, we looked at all your existing requirements and then looked at your ownership rate to ensure that we are, again, not requiring certainly lower or higher. That would be actually very difficult to achieve. So we think the recommendations are certainly achievable, and which is what we're looking to include in the sort of the draft of the zoning bylaw. And I think that's the last parking slide. If you can just. So in terms of next steps, as I and both Matt have mentioned, we are certainly very happy to take any questions or any input that anybody might have, and we're looking to refine the zoning bylaw based on input from members of the council and residents. We're looking to update the zoning bylaw in April and May, and really look for council adoption late spring when we feel we're ready to come forward with a recommended adoption. And Mr. Chair, that concludes my presentation. I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Greg, and thank you, Mr. Bruder. We are now going to move into our delegations, and we have 5 individuals that have requested to be included in this public hearing. Please note that delegations may speak for a maximum of 5 minutes. Once we have received the delegations, committee will then transition directly into the report and the motion. Our first delegation for this item is Martin Leclerc. Martin, please go ahead.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, you're good, Martin.
Okay, so I'm a new resident to the town of Lincoln. I moved here last year. I bought a house with my fiance. And, when we moved to the town of Lincoln, we made that decision based off of the housing prices and, the area. We love the area. What I found recently is the prices of housing in the area have significantly increased. And I find that the way the zoning bylaw has been updated and it's far enough to address housing affordability and intensification. I think it protects large underutilized lots that go against the Ontario government's directive on urban intensification. And if you notice, it goes against the Ontario Housing Affordability Task Force recent report that, there's not enough housing, and their recommendations say that we need to make these changes and focus more on intensification than, keeping neighborhoods frozen in time. And I think that, like the presenter said, they want to create walkable communities. If you're constantly having single detached housing in R1 areas, and that's what's taking up the bulk of the urban area in the town of Lincoln, how are you going to have a walkable area? You're going to increase car dependency. Your parking requirements aren't going to go unchanged in the future. People aren't going to be able to live, work, and shop in this great place that we call home. And, it really makes it tough for people that I know my age to get into the housing market, because it's decisions like these, not allowing duplexes in R1 zones. Of course, you have secondary units, but it's not the same. More investors are attracted to duplexes than they are secondary residential units. You're not increasing rental affordability. You're not going to be increasing housing affordability. You're going to exacerbate a problem that has sent the average home price as of last year over $930,000. And I believe that the way it was originally written, because I attended the first meeting, that it was more of a step in the right direction versus how it is now. Essentially, nothing has changed in terms of frontage requirements, depth requirements, lot size requirements from almost 30 years ago when this bylaw was first created. And I think that's the wrong way to continue our housing practices. And that's my opinion, that we need to work harder to increase intensification. And that's it for me. Sorry.
Thank you, Martin. Are there any clarifying questions to the delegate from committee? Seeing none. Thank you. Our next delegation is Angela Little. Angela, please go ahead.
Great, thank you. I don't seem to be able to turn my video on, but maybe I don't need it. So thank you. Good evening. Thank you for this opportunity to address council. My name is Angela Lytle and I live in Beamsville South on Ashby Drive. The proposed residential zoning bylaw categories seek to diversify dwelling build forms in residential areas considerably, including areas that involve infilling existing residential neighborhoods. I'll speak to some concerns related to this expansion of build forms, in particular, the proposed RM1 zoning. If we could advance to the next slide, please. My specific concern I wanted to discuss tonight was the inclusion of maisonettes, also known more commonly as back-to-back townhomes, which have no backyards, that are included in the RM1 residential zoning category. In many places, back-to-backs are placed directly in front of other homes or townhomes to the detriment of sight lines, natural light, and landscaping. They usually require off-municipal road management, including road fees that create a range of problems related to waste collection, snow removal, and exacerbate parking issues. Not only do they create excessive building heights and surface parking where landscaping could be, it creates social pressure where residents, many of them families trying to afford a home, try to navigate their lives in increasingly tighter spaces. We see this already in our community now. Additional problems associated with back-to-backs, as noted in a 2017 City of Mississauga report, include lack of storage, lack of outdoor and recreational space, undesirable utilities and services locations, property maintenance issues, and reduced landscaping or green areas. There may be appropriate places for back-to-back townhomes, such as along an urban streetscape with mixed and taller build forms and smaller land availability, but I have specific concerns about proposed RM1 zoning on the future residential development of the former Cavalry church lands off Hickson Street, which is adjacent to my own property, as well as in the center of the ecological conservation zone of the former Christmas tree farm located in the area off King Street. As you see on the slide, under the previous zoning map that I have been watching for the last year from the town website, on the left side, the new development plan for the Cavalry church site would, in that case, mirror the existing neighborhood, a mix of low and medium density towns, semis and singles, parallel to the established neighborhoods on either side. The proposed change shown on the map on the right is RM1 zoning for that parcel of land, as well as in the center of the former Christmas tree farm ecological zone. In my opinion, introducing back-to-backs in this context is not appropriate. This is only one specific example, and no doubt others exist across Lincoln. I request council to remove the maisonette category from the RM1 zoning to ensure that this build form is not pre-approved for inappropriate areas. It is significantly different from other townhome categories and should be treated as such. I'm also opposed to the proposed reduction of parking for townhomes generally. Living in a townhome, I'd like to say we don't have too much stuff in our garage, but for many of us, our small homes are crowded, hence the overflow into the garages. In addition, given that a large quantity of small condos and towns are envisioned for the GO station area along Ontario Street, as well as at Prudence Landing, it's my view that retaining some medium to low density zoning, especially in this area on the Cavalry Church property, is appropriate to the location and ensures more diverse array of housing options for new residents to our community. Next slide, please. The second concern I'd like to highlight tonight is the impact of significantly broadening residential zoning bylaw categories on democratic process. I raise this question: what happens to consultation and meaningful resident and council input on development applications if all these changes are implemented at this time? As it is, and the entire council only enters into discussion about development applications when a bylaw variance is required. In this way, the opportunity is created to promote meaningful engagement when a significant change that impacts the communities involved. By applying expanded bylaw categories too widely, we risk inappropriate build forms being approved without significant opportunity for debate and discussion. As residents, we have been asking for enhanced input and not a reduction. Accordingly, I recommend a further review of what is included in intensive zoning categories and where they will be placed around Lincoln, further assessment of potential negative impacts of intensification policies on an area by area basis. This is not that I'm against density, but how do we balance growth and density with the social and physical infrastructure needed to support our growing population? My last point is that I think we need to look at how to promote greater resident consultation and input into residential zoning bylaw categories prior to the adoption. The documents are long and they're hard to read and understand. The average person can't plow through them. I would suggest providing, for example, visual models of what the build forms will look like within each zoning category to enhance accessibility of information to residents before final decisions are made, so there can be more robust input. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Angela, and thank you for keeping it right on 5 minutes. Are there any clarifying questions to the delegate from committee? I'm seeing none, Deputy Clerk.
I see none also. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next delegation is David Jacobs. David, please go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. Good evening, Mayor Easton and members of council. Thank you for your time today. The first point has been confirmed, so I will move on to the second point, which is I want to talk briefly about maisonettes. The definition in the bylaw outlines the built form in detail, but yet in parentheses, it says also known as back-to-back townhouses, but only the word maisonette is used elsewhere in the bylaw. And by the way, these units have no backyards. This is one of only 2 built forms that has no illustration/diagram in the bylaw after the definition. It would be very helpful to put an illustration into the bylaw document for this building form, as well as stacked townhouses. In regard to RM zone on page 107, section 6.2, has maisonette dwellings in RM1, RM2, and RM3. I would like to request council to direct staff to remove maisonettes, back-to-back townhouses, from RM1 and only leave them in RM2 and RM3 zones where there are more compatible built forms, such as stacked townhouses for these higher intensification areas. Further to this request, there are 2 areas which are zoned RM1 on Schedule A3 in the Beamsville South zoning map, the Cavalry lands and Christmas tree farmlands. And I am asking council to request staff to change the zoning on these 2 areas to R1 and R2 only. The term maisonette is not widely known as a building form. It dates back to London, England in 1947. It was a built form seen in the 60s as a rental accommodation, usually with a common hallway element. I think the term maisonette should be removed and replaced with a more understood and more relevant term for the 21st century, back-to-back townhouses, that will then be understood by the public. I have made a point of asking quite a few people over the past few weeks if they knew what a maisonette was as a type of house, and not one of them knew what it was. So why use a term like this in a bylaw? Lastly, I would like to take a minute to comment on the Prudence proposal bylaw change, which I did not find until yesterday as they were buried at the bottom of the page of Speak Up Lincoln. I have a couple of questions or comments. One, is Speak Up Lincoln considered to be the only public engagement/consultation for these proposed changes? 2, some of the floor increases appear to be up to 3 times what they were in the original secondary plan. What is the driver behind these changes when there are already significant intensifications proposed on these lands with the existing approved secondary plan? 3, if these changes are approved, will they also be considered just a guideline or minimums similar to the Green Lane application, and that they could possibly get approved with an even much higher height? Will the parkland be adequate for the larger number of residents being proposed? It appears that a large number, I believe 120 back-to-back townhouses, have displaced some of the employment land. Where are the people going to work if the intent is for a complete community? These higher heights will literally obliterate the view of the lake from the south, and I'm asking council to say no to the proposed Prudence bylaw changes to continue to support the existing secondary plan. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, David. Are there any questions of committee to the delegation? Seeing none, our next delegation is Johar Singh. Johar, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you, councillors. I'd like to comment today on some key concerns regarding the proposed residential bylaw changes and their potential adverse effects on the community. The first specific concern I wanted to raise today is regarding the placement of RM1 residential zoning, which includes an array of intensified build forms, including the maisonettes and the back-to-back townhouses spoken to earlier by Angela and David already. So I won't continue there. But my concern is regarding the RM1 zoning inside of this ecological zone. You can see on the slide here, Angela spoke to it earlier, but right inside of this green space to the right of the slide is a little RM1 patch. This specific parcel of land is found on the former Christmas Tree Farm, which is off King Street between Aberdeen and Ashby Drive. This is very close to my home. I live right across from it. And I'd like to know whether this is an appropriate site for residential development of this kind of density. As you can see from the zoning diagram, the site's surrounded by, on all sides, by a forested area that is zoned as ecological conservation zone. And it's also surrounded by ravines and currently is the habitat for a family of bald eagles. You may have seen pictures of them around the community, just majestic creatures, and this happens to be where their nest is. So it's not clear to me why this site is currently zoned as RM1, and I'm concerned about what the impact will be on the environmental conservation zone if a broad RM1 zoning parcel is approved at the center of this particularly ecologically sensitive and significant area. Also, given that Niagara Region is in the process of creating a natural environment system that also protects ecologically sensitive lands within the urban boundary, I'm not sure that RM zoning is entirely appropriate in this area. So accordingly, I'd urge council to move to a low density residential designation inside the zone to reduce the impact on the surrounding ecological conservation area. And also to review the regional natural environmental system protections for ecologically significant land within the urban boundary to assess the most appropriate designation for that particular parcel of land. Next slide, please. The second point I want to address today is the need for measures to help balance and mitigate the impact of any urban intensification on our community. Prior to approving any sweeping like residential bylaw changes that will support high density infill within the urban boundaries, I think a parallel process of designating additional open space to create green space, social and recreational space for future residents is required. As our housing gets smaller and build forms that have no exterior property are proposed, including some of those properties that don't have any kind of front or back space, we'll need more green spaces for residents to access within their neighborhoods. Green space, natural spaces, even small parcels of open space are hugely important for quality of life. They have positive benefits. I think the pandemic has shown us just how important having spaces to walk to are. Both for physical, mental health, as well as for positive environmental impacts, including climate change mitigation. The fact is, we know that we're going to develop within the urban boundary, but once we do that, we can't get it back. So I think we owe it to ourselves and to future residents who will be mostly living in smaller townhouses and smaller spaces with smaller yard space or no yard space at all, to ensure that they have adequate open space that they can reach by walking from their homes. So accordingly, I'd urge council to fully review the ecological impacts of the proposed residential intensification that will result from these bylaw changes, and to ensure that there are parallel measures to incorporate open space for future residents, particularly ecological and accessible open green spaces within the urban boundary, and any other areas, of course, that are targeted for intensification. So with that, I yield my time back. Thank you very much for having me as a delegate today.
I think Mr. Chair is frozen, Madam Clerk.
Yes. Or he's staying very still.
Is our clerk frozen too?
I think Tony's back.
Tony's back.
Deputy Clerk, everything was frozen and then I was gone.
No problem either. I was frozen too. I came into the town clerk's office to see if she was frozen as well. But it looks like we are good to go.
Okay, I'm sorry, were there any questions for the final delegate? Madam Clerk? Our fifth and final delegation will be Byron Dodd. Byron, please go ahead.
Is Byron still with us?
I am, but someone has stopped my video and I cannot reactivate it myself.
I just asked you to start your video. There you go.
Okay.
Thank you.
I know the, sorry, my name is Byron Dodd. Thank you for the opportunity to speak tonight. I just want to thank the chair, mayor, and council. I know they haven't spoken yet on the zoning bylaws for agriculture, but I did want to speak to them just real quickly. After I went through the entire plan, it looks like the zoning bylaw plan has spoken a lot to residential community and some other aspects of the town, which is absolutely fantastic. But I'm a part of the agricultural sector, and I just came back from a wonderful summit that the town had put on about our agricultural sector, specifically in tourism and how they're moving forwards with tourism in the town, which was absolutely awesome. But what I did notice is in the zoning bylaw amendments, there's not a lot of information, or at least not a lot of information in the November 2021 draft that I have. And something else that I noticed is that the zoning capacities and capabilities of diversified agricultural use is very low, and that it didn't address a lot of things that are currently happening in the town. So one of the things I did notice is it does say diversified use, but something I think that the town of Lincoln has that no one else has is the diversification of their agricultural sector directly into tourism and education. We're massively positioned to make a lot of big waves in that sector and really move forwards. And I noticed that our zoning bylaws that are being put forwards so far don't really represent the town's capability or capacity to grow further in that area. And I was just wondering if there'd be further consultation on the zoning bylaws in terms of agri-education and agritourism. And if there is new updates on that, when they'd be getting released to the general public so that we could actually see what's going on in that sector with the bylaws. The other thing I just wanted to address, which is completely off topic from a business perspective in agritourism, that I noticed through some bylaws in other towns as well. EV cars are becoming a huge factor in designing townships and parking spaces. Something that really needs to be considered now when designing parking spaces is the ability to charge EVs. When we talk about parking spaces, if we talk about parking on streets, we talk about cords potentially running to a person's car across sidewalks, which is a huge hazard and liability. So I'd really encourage you as a town to really look at what's going to happen as EVs become more on board in our township, and how that's going to be addressed with older neighborhoods, as well as addressing it with new neighborhoods and planning in the future. So I yield the rest of my time. Thank you.
Thank you, Byron. Appreciate your comments. Are there any clarifying questions to the delegate from committee members? Councillor Rinjima.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Byron, for your comments. I'm going to ask if you can expand a little bit on what you feel is missing from this draft bylaw related to agriculture. I'm not completely sure I understand. I know there's something interesting in there, but can you expand on it? Maybe a little bit more specific.
Am I still on? Yes. So in the current draft bylaw that I have, there's actually very little written at all about the agritourism sector or diversified use sector in terms of agriculture. It's very quick and brief. It's not very diverse. And I think there could be more consultation put into that, as well as agri-education wasn't put in as a separate topic at all on the zoning bylaw. I really do feel that Lincoln is highly positioned with agri-education, and they really need to consider it into their zoning bylaws to make sure that that mixed use of a property is really put down and written down so that people understand what's going on with that. I think, like I said, the town's hugely positioned to do something. We refer to breweries, wineries, distilleries, agritourism, all as separate topics on our zoning bylaws, but not education. So I think that's something that could be have a lot more clarification around it.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to ask for a little more clarification on that when we get to back to the report.
Okay.
Thanks.
Councillor Michalak.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Through you to Brian. Thank you for coming and providing an agricultural piece to this. Just, I'm not sure what agriculture industry are you a part of? Do you have greenhouse? Are you in the greenhouse industry at all?
Yes, I'm in the greenhouse industry, and that's the sector I'm currently in. Yeah, but the company I'm with, the Watering Can, we're starting to change. I have to be careful what I say. We're going to be utilizing some of our property not just for greenhouses anymore. We'll be adding other agricultural pieces.
So through you, Mr. Chair, if I may ask Brian a question, in the zoning bylaw report and recommendation, there was parking requirements for staff, and that includes the warehouse workers. Is there do you employ migrant workers where they would be classified as requiring a vehicle, and should they require a vehicle? What are your thoughts on parking requirements in that respect?
So currently I don't employ any migrant workers. I do know that there's a Lincoln greenhouse group that would be able to speak to that a lot better in terms of migrant workers and parking. But it is my understanding that most migrant workers don't have vehicles. So I don't think they would require a lot of parking in that sense. But like I said, I would defer to the Lincoln greenhouse group to give you a much clearer picture of what that is exactly.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Councillor Michalak. Byron, I appreciate your comments, and I would suggest to your comment about agricultural related uses and on-farm diversification, if you've got the time, after we discuss this report, our next public meeting this evening is to talk about application that speaks to exactly that subject. So if you've got some time over the next 20 minutes, we're going to go right into that after we finish this report. It's our second public meeting, so it might be of interest to you.
I would be more than happy to stay. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Byron. There being no further discussions, no more delegations for this item, I now declare this public meeting to address the draft comprehensive zoning bylaw by the town of Lincoln adjourned. I have a motion moved by Councillor Timmers that council receive and file as information the following delegations regarding item 5.1 Draft Comprehensive Zoning Bylaw by the Town of Lincoln. Martin Leclerc, Angela Lytle, David Jacobs, Johar Singh, and Byron Dodd. I will now ask our Deputy Clerk to call out the vote.
Thank you, Chair. And with that, I will ask Councillor Pachiriba.
Rumi going first. Yes.
Councillor Reimer,
Yes.
Councillor Timmers,
Yes.
Mayor Easton,
Support.
Councillor Russell,
Yes.
Councillor Rajima,
Yes.
Councillor McPherson,
Yes.
Councillor Miklick,
Yes.
Councillor Bernay.
Yes,
Thank you. That carries, Chair.
thank you. We will now move directly into the report PD 11-22 regarding the draft comprehensive zoning bylaw by the Town of Lincoln. Are there any questions from council to the consultant and staff? I believe Deputy Clerk Councillor Rinjima was first.
Yes, thank you.
Councillor Rinjima, please proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. One of the delegations, I think it was Mr. Jacobs, had a question about the map that we saw for Prudence. And earlier on, when Mr. Bruder spoke, I believe, and I'm looking for clarification on this, that what Mr. Bruder said was that everything that we see laid out in that map and all the proposed densities do not mean that there's been any changes to the zoning as was approved through the landowners' earlier applications. Is that right? Do I have that right? Everything that we see in there falls within what was previously approved, or do I have that wrong?
Mr. Bruder?
Through you. Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. No, Councillor, what I tried to do was I tried to show or talk about first the areas where there are still zoning updates needed. So there wasn't previous approval, like I mentioned, those singles along the waterfront promenade on the north side. Some of the additional height and density east of the Main Street mixed use area where there's high-rise residential already. There's increases further to some height and densities that weren't previously approved as part of our initial zoning that was approved back in 2019. The same with the employment block. There's some changes there as well. And then a couple of other areas resulting from that. There's the building C, the blue building that's employment that's moved to the northwest corner of the roundabout. That wasn't previously there, that's been moved. And then there's some also some changes, minor changes at the just to the west of Main Street mixed use there, the magenta color. So there are a few things that do require zoning updates, but then I tried to also touch on some things that didn't in terms of some reorganization, realignment of some private lanes or local roads. Some of the townhouses that are in the western end, there was zoning flexibility already there for singles or towns. So those things were already in place, but there are some zoning updates needed to accommodate the flexibility that I was speaking to, Councillor. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you. Just to clarify or to paraphrase what you just said, some of these things, some of what we're seeing is was already incorporated within the previously approved zoning, and some of it is a town-led zoning amendment in some areas of this plan. Is that right?
Through you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, some of it was already there in terms of zoning permission. Some of the items that I spoke to during the presentation. Some of the other ones is kind of what we're working with alongside the property owner, alongside with legal representation, our consultant at WSP, and then of course taking into context provincial direction and policy, and also working along with our regional counterparts too.
Okay, thank you. And I have another question, Mr. Chair.
Go ahead, Councillor.
Another one of our delegations asked, Mr. Singh asked about how can we incorporate more open space within our urban boundary? So are we doing that? Have we done this within this draft zoning bylaw? And if not, how would we do such a thing if we decided we wanted to do that?
Through you, Mr. Chair, that's a good question, Councillor, and it's going to take a strategic approach to do something like that, maybe a touch beyond the scope of a zoning bylaw update. If it's not property that we already own, it'd be something where we'd have to get buy-in from whatever property owner does own that property in question. I can tell you, through our development applications too, we have been looking at more innovative ways to open up some open space. You saw with a recent planning application, there was a publicly accessible private space that's maintained by a condo corporation. I think some of these examples we're going to see more of. We do also look at larger areas in terms of, is there potential to obtain park space rather than cash in lieu of parkland? A lot of times with some of these smaller development sites, it's important to note we only get 5% of the lands that we can have dedicated to us. And, if the site's small to begin with, that really only creates a pocket-sized small park. And if we had them all over the town in a patchwork, I think that would be a little bit difficult and onerous from a maintenance standpoint and even from a service level standpoint. So to answer your question, there's definitely some strategy involved that staff will continue to work, throughout the town, all the different departments, including our community services team, to identify maybe where there is potential options for more open space. But it as part of the zoning update, it's kind of hard to implement because, as I said, we don't really own any suitable large piece of land for that at the moment.
Yeah, thank you. I know it's, I think we all see the long-term benefits of it. It's just a question of how do you make that happen? As you're saying, it sounds like it needs a multifaceted approach. And I know next we're going to be talking about CIPs. So I don't know if there's anything within those proposed incentives that speaks to providing more green space, more amenity space within developments and within our urban boundary. But that's a question for the next item on the agenda. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. I'm going to request that we on the first round, we ask a maximum of 2 questions. Our screen is lit up and hopefully if anyone has more than 2 questions, another councillor will hopefully raise the question. We'll get our questions answered, but I will go back to a 3rd round if necessary. Councillor Russell, please go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I will try to organize my 2 questions now. Through you, I'm not sure if it would go to Mr. Bruder or to Mr. Bender, the presenter. I just want to go back to the parking information that was provided in the presentation by Mr. Bender. I'm wondering if, I know that he did reference that the data is a little bit outdated. It's from 2016 with some COVID implications on sourcing updated data. I'm wondering if we could get an update on that data to provide us a clearer snapshot of where we stand today as far as the vehicles per building type. But I would also like to see, if possible, some trend information. So if we could go back a few years to see if those numbers are increasing over time. So if in 2013 or 2014, the average number of vehicles per household in a semi-detached might have been 1.79 and now it's 2.19. What might it be in a few years? I think kind of drawing the line at a point in time back in 2016 to say this should be the standard is a little dangerous, knowing that over the last 5-6 years and really even prior, as a number of people have already noted, the housing costs have dramatically increased. And again, the overall family unit has drastically changed that. Now we have, or we're likely to see a lot more children staying at home longer, probably into their late 20s, early 30s, which is going to increase the number of vehicles. And we actually are probably seeing a lot more of parents now or grandparents living with families to expand that nuclear family. So that could also increase the vehicle size. So I'm just wondering if we could get some trend information to kind of give us an idea of if that number is increasing, is it decreasing, which maybe would then support the narrative. But I think we have to try to do our best possible to figure out what, looking through the imaginary crystal ball of where are the needs of our residents are now. and then try to put a best plan forward for that coming up. So that's my request to Mr. Bruder or to Mr. Bender for an update. My second question would be, I guess it would go back to Mr. Singh and Mr. Jacobs and Ms. Little's question about the masonette. And I think that'd be to Mr. Bruder. If you could give some more information on that masonette building type or building, and just give us some more insight into why that was included this time in particular. Are there advantages? Are there disadvantages? Is it something that we should take a look at as removing as requested? Any insight, Mr. Bruder?
Through you, Mr. Chair, I'll go on that one first, and then I'll let Mr. Bender address the parking question and confirmation that you were looking at. But when it comes to masonettes, yeah, I mean, typically that built form back-to-back style, it is a little bit of a higher density potentially than some of the other townhouse types, but traditionally, when you look at kind of the RM1 zone, it's that, you know, you're going past the single detached, you're including some more kind of multiple unit dwelling types, but not to the point where you're into apartments or anything like that. And then when you have your R2 and your R3 zones, typically those are increasing a little bit more quickly in terms of density, and there's less of those zones. I think I can tell you that, you know, from a masonette point of view, you know, the point made about including a visual in there and maybe refining the definition, I think that's something we can definitely do and work towards. As for not including them in RM1 and but rather RM2 and RM3, that's something we're going to take away as well. We can have a look at it. I'm not necessarily opposed to reviewing anything, but I can tell you just typically, and this again all goes back to the same thing about trying to encourage, you know, a little bit more of a compact build form. We use the term sometimes gentle intensification in areas that are a little bit more stable. You know, instead of having a low-rise apartment, you'd have maybe a block of back-to-back, something like that. But I appreciate the comments that were received tonight, and we'll definitely look at it. Thank you.
And Mr. Bender on the data?
Yeah, and through you, Mr. Chair, to Councillor Russell, thank you for the questions. As it relates to the parking data being outdated, you're right. I was told by our transportation planners that that was the most recent information they could get. So in terms of revisiting that, as I mentioned, that's actually one of the recommendations, that when additional study be undertaken, that would then be updated in the zoning bylaw based on that, should that be any different than what was found back in 2016. As it relates to looking back further to determine trends and how things have changed, I can certainly take that back to our transportation planners to see if they could provide a bit sort of a larger picture of how things have changed. Certainly we can do that. Yeah, I think that was in essence the two major questions that you had. Certainly, you know, we want to capture, you know, the households in Lincoln, and trying to figure out those trends will certainly help that.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll come back.
Thank you, Councillor. Mayor Easton.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to direct this question to Mr. Bender. Thank you very much for your presentation. I also want to thank all of the delegates for participating this evening. Mr. Bender, I'm sure that you're well aware of the growth pattern that is occurring in Niagara. And I'm curious to know how you incorporated the demands for growth. In fact, the specific numbers that we've been given. How did you incorporate those, or are they incorporated in this draft?
Through you, Mr. Chair, to Mayor Easton, it's a great question. Certainly, we all appreciate the significant efforts that the region is currently going through to update their planning documents to conform to the somewhat newly minted growth plan from 2020. But in terms of the zoning bylaw, we don't have the ability to conform to any sort of new numbers generated by the province or the region, because we actually have to conform to your existing official plan. Once the region gets their official plan adopted and approved by the province, then each of the local municipalities in the region are required within 1 year to conform to that document. And then once the town updates their official plan, then they would then go through this process again to update your zoning bylaw to conform to your new official plan. So the numbers that you might be speaking of related to the province or the region, the zoning bylaw does not incorporate that, because we actually can't.
Okay, and so are you, is your advice that we need to keep these things in mind as we're going forward, or do we just forget about them?
And through you, Mr. Chair, to Mary Easton, we always have to keep these in mind. Certainly as, you know, there's rarely a scenario where municipalities won't need to accommodate additional growth to 2051. But as the region moves through their process, it certainly behooves the town to be very mindful of that and what impacts it does have on the town in terms of future growth. And getting your documents updated in a timely fashion will help that.
All right, thank you very much. Thanks, Mr. Bender. Mr. Chairman, I have a question of Mr. Bruder. Matt, I believe that the zoning in the area that we have defined just a week ago in terms of the moratorium, I believe that the zoning on most of the properties that's on the south side of Regional 81 would be in the at least the R2 zone, possibly RM. Can you confirm what the zoning is in that area? So that's from Bartlett Road up to Lincoln Avenue. It may not be that simple, but what would the majority of properties be zoned as?
Through you, Mr. Chair, Your Worship, you're talking about south on King Street?
Yes, on the south side. Mm-hmm.
So it's a little bit of a mixed bag. Going from Bartlett over to Lincoln, you've got a little piece of general commercial right at Bartlett. You've got quite a bit of R1s and R2s for the next little stretch. And then around King Street, obviously, you've got your general commercial central business district. And then proceeding beyond there, yeah, you've got R2s and R1s with another small piece of general commercial at the far end near Lincoln Ave. That's just generally speaking.
Okay, so I'm bringing this up because I want to make sure that with the moratorium in place, that we complement it with a change in zoning. Otherwise, we're really just inviting a lot more density in that area. And I think this is a difficult one because the idea of looking at heritage districts isn't to prevent development. In fact, I don't believe we can do that. But I want to make sure that the zoning along that strip doesn't complicate the matters even further. When you were looking at, what were you thinking we might end up with the zoning along that strip in the R2 areas?
Through you, Mr. Chair, I actually didn't really contemplate any major changes to the zoning itself. I think when we go through the Heritage Conservation District study, that's really going to identify what we need in terms of implementing some design and protection measures, which is really, that's the impetus from a heritage protection standpoint of what we need to look at. From a zoning perspective, I in all honesty, I didn't see a lot of changes coming out of this. We haven't received requests for changes from these R1 and R2 properties. So my opinion, we were likely going to leave them be at this point.
But we won't be able to reverse the R2s if we do have an application. So we could end up with fairly extensive townhouse developments in that strip. Isn't that correct?
Through you, Your Worship, in the R2, we probably, well, that's a good point. But I think in the R2 zone, that wouldn't be as much of a concern. That's when we look at semis and duplexes and things like that. But I can get back to you with a little more information on, perhaps a way forward in that regard. But it's a good question to raise too, because some of these properties are a little bit larger in terms of their lot size and maybe a little bit more conducive to some development interests, which is why we went forward with the moratorium in the first place. So definitely something I can take away.
Okay, that's great. Mr. Chairman, that's my two for the moment. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Councillor McPherson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And my initial questions are going to be on the Prudence, the proposed changes to the Prudence landing development. And, looking back a couple of years on the Prudence secondary plan, we really went to great effort and expense to to reach out to the public through a number of charrettes and public meetings to really get the input of our residents in building out that plan. And we all know that piece of property is arguably the largest open piece of developable property, certainly in the Greater Golden Horseshoe and possibly around the lake. So I liked what I heard earlier that we're going to look at other public meetings. I think that we do. It's in our best interest that more consultation and really some separate, deliberate, and focused meetings specific to the Prudence plan are really the right thing to do. I just think that we need to engage our public more than tonight. So, and I guess specifically to the folks out there in Victoria Shores who are the neighboring community within the Prudence development, that they were the vocal ones, that really came out, in the tens of, and maybe even well over 100 to some of the meetings that we had. So I think we really do need to open up this public meeting discussion and be very inclusive of others that may not have responded tonight. Maybe we need to take the meeting to them and really to get their input. And through you, Mr. Chair, my question through to Mr. Bruder is around would it make sense for us to separate out the Prudence development from the zoning bylaw? And the reason I ask that is, we all know that these development proposals can take some time to come to an agreement. There is some back and forth. There is modifications made. There is more modifications made, and heaven forbid, we don't come to an agreement and we end up at a tribunal, and we're a year from now or 2 years from now. And how does that then affect the zoning bylaw? And are we able to approve the zoning bylaw when we're still in a back and forth on the Prudence property?
Mr. Bruder?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Through you to the councillor. Yeah, that's a great question, councillor, and definitely, I appreciate the looking forward in terms of what could be. I think from a standpoint, first of all, for additional consultation, including with Victoria Shores, absolutely, definitely point well taken. Something that we'll be moving forward with. But from the standpoint of what happens, maybe I can talk about what would happen. Let's just say if there was a holdup specific with Prudence. Typically with zoning bylaws, if there's a portion of it that's appealed, kind of similar to what happened with the Prudence secondary plan, where there was a deferred piece that needed more consultation with the province and whatnot, the eastern piece, because it was in the Greenbelt, it would kind of operate the same way, where you can have a piece of what's being brought forward for the zoning bylaw that's a subject of an appeal that can be kind of deferred and removed until an appeal decision is reached. But you can go forward, as I understand it, with the rest of the zoning bylaw. But regardless, it's something we can take away to have further discussion on in terms of, what's the best avenue? Is it pulling it right out or not? But I can certainly say from the standpoint of additional consultation that we will move forward in that regard.
Thank you, Matt, for that. And question to Chair Bernay. So Matt, through you to Matt. So Matt, we are talking about our increased densities on another report tonight, or not densities, increased targets that the region is putting out there. And we know, in discussions on recent developments, a lot of discussion about provincial targets not being reflected in our current secondary plans, in our current OP. This being, such a large project, I wonder if you have, or you could make comment on, do we reassess the Prudence property, updating the densities?
Through you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, it's a good question as well. You heard it from Mr. Bender. You know, the growth plan has been updated. It was updated in 2020. It was after the secondary plan and even the zoning regulations and draft plan for Prudence were approved. So quite frankly, that was part of this whole exercise too. As we're going through the zoning bylaw update, we did want to take an opportunity here to step back and say, okay, you know, is there an opportunity to reassess here a little bit? I think what you're asking me, you know, from a technical standpoint, have we actually done the math in terms of the growth numbers to see where we're at with Prudence and how much we need to increase? It's a little bit of a moving target, to be honest, because you know, these targets are exactly that. They're forecasts out to 2051. A lot can happen from now until then. A lot's happened in the past few years. But I think what we looked at here is we wanted to give ourselves some leeway, so kind of some opportunity to look at that now, and even more as we move forward through the build out of this, you know, that there is that flexibility. Should it be proven again from a servicing standpoint, from a traffic standpoint, that this property can handle potential increases in height and density, you know, that if that can't happen, you know, if the technical justification and technical solutions can't be had, well, then that's why the holding provisions are there. That's still a control, and you know, the additional permissions wouldn't be applicable. So I think, you know, that's kind of the objective here, is we're trying to look at it in terms of the ever-changing climate when it comes to growth targets, and just so we can build in some flexibility should we need to adjust moving forward, and, you know, should we need to assess the feasibility of such.
Just a follow-up comment, Mr. Chair, if I may. So you know, I don't imagine it can be done, you know, quickly, but you know, I'm just looking at this as such a significant decision, you know, in looking at, you know, what is it going to be, 6,000, 7,000, 8,000 people, whatever it is. And in knowing that our information or our current densities are dated, and we know, and there seems to be that, you know, we always kind of fall back on that with developers saying, well, your densities are out of date, you know, so, you know, we're just telling you what the province is saying. So for us to go through the exercise of updating those densities to today's densities, you know, would give us so much more information in making that decision as to, all right, we've got the current densities, here they are. So just in the public meeting, you know, since we're looking at the Prudence property, that would be my comment. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Councillor. Deputy Clerk, I'm showing Councillor Reimer, followed by Councillor Mikulik. Is that correct? Councillor Reimer.
Correct.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Chair Brunet. Thank you to Mr. Bender and the rest of the delegates for participating tonight. My first question regarding back-to-back towns is very similar to Councillor Russell's, and thank you for answering that. Just my one other question, Chair Brunet, through you to probably Matt, I guess, just concerning timing and process. On page 6 of our report, of this report, the regional official plan is under review. It states our town official plan will be required to be updated to conform to that. As such, our town zoning bylaw will have to be updated to reflect our town official plan. Just looking for, are we doing things twice here, or just maybe chronologically how this will take place, or the best way for this to take place?
Through you, Mr. Chair, through you, Mr. Chair. I think that's definitely something, you know, I could see that coming to mind when that was being mentioned. You know, I've thought about the timing quite a bit of this, and the real, you know, the reality of planning in general these days, when we talk about growth targets and things, it's always fluid. Things seem to be constantly in motion, and I find, you know, sometimes if you wait for everything, okay, here we go, and you know, and you go finalize your document, well, then you might be setting yourself up for yet another round of potential changes. That's how quickly it's honestly been happening. So, you know, I look at our zoning bylaw, and while Mr. Bender's correct, we can't necessarily specifically and strictly address the zoning targets that might be being laid out by the region in their new official plan. I can certainly tell you, we're still looking at their work on their regional official plan based on provincial policy legislation for a lot of other things. We heard earlier today about agricultural, on-farm diversified uses, agricultural related uses. I can tell you from a zoning perspective, we need a lot of work on that. And I don't think that's something that's going to change too significantly when the region finalizes their official plan. We've already been working with them very closely on that. So I could see us being very closely aligned like that. I think, when we do have to go through that conformity exercise with our official plan, leading to some further changes in our zoning bylaw, I don't necessarily think it's going to be redundant. I think, there's going to be portions of it that we've already, we're in a good spot. And yeah, there might be portions we need to tweak further, but I think it sets us out well, regardless, to move forward. Hopefully that answers your question.
Yep, no, that's great. No, thank you very much. Thank you, Chair Brunet.
Thank you, Councillor Reimer. Deputy Chair Michalak, please go ahead.
Thank you, Councillor Brunet. Through you to either Greg or Matt. Going down the road about parking a little bit, with regards to tandem parking and the successes of that, if there are successes, when I'm looking at this review at section 3.32 regarding secondary residential units, they'll require one space that can be tandem. Is that in tandem with a car that's in a garage, with a car behind the car in the garage? Is that a 3 tandem parking situation possibly with these sorts of things? And the reason why I ask this is when I looked up the parking requirements to parking spaces 1.78 and best practices and what other municipalities are doing, I seem to, when I Google up or when I search parking issues or parking problems, this seems to be a headache for other councils.
Mr. Bender, did you want to try to tackle that one?
Sure, through you, Mr. Chair, to Councillor Michalak. So it's a very good question, and I apologize if it sounded like you were asking about tandem and how that might be applied. So just for those who are unaware, tandem parking refers to basically almost like a bumper-to-bumper situation parking, where that individual car, say at the back, which may or may not be in a sort of a covered parking space, would be essentially blocked. So the car in front of it would have to be moved in order to get out. But it is a parking solution. So it's kind of why we were using that as an example. I can't speak to impacts from that. I just do know it is a parking solution where space might be tight on a particular property. But given how many of us park in many of us parking in a driveway, most cases it already is tandem on an individual driveway.
So, and I asked that question because, you have 2 people living in a home and somebody has to go to work first or this and that. It's to me, I think that most people choose to park on the street to avoid that situation. So that's just my thoughts on the successes of tandem parking as it pertains to that. So, and just to add to that parking issue or parking solution or parking discussion, should we be looking at parking not by the unit, but by the bedrooms, by the living space? Rather, like it's one parking unit. Is that for a 3-bedroom condo, a 1-bedroom condo, a 4-bedroom house, a 0-bedroom apartment? Is that what we're doing here?
And through you, Mr. Chair, to Councillor Michalak, another very good question, but we typically look at parking for residential purposes on a dwelling unit basis. So if there's a house with a secondary unit, for instance, there would be 2 separate dwelling units requiring 2 separate types of parking. So you would require, if it's a single detached dwelling, 2 parking spaces and then 1 extra space for that secondary residential unit, as an example.
Okay. And then through you, Mr. Chair, I have another question.
Was that your second one, or are you trying to sneak a third one in there? Make it quick, Council.
Well, those parking ones were kind of all they're all in the same sort of a segue, but
I'm going to give you a little latitude. Go ahead.
Appreciate that. So in the Beamsville secondary plan, there's a revision. There's a office commercial instead of industrial. Are the uses the same?
Through you, Mr. Chair, to Councillor Mikulik.
Mr. Bender?
Could you hear me okay?
Yes, go ahead, Mr.
Okay. Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. So through you to Councillor Mikulik. The office commercial zone was meant to really conform to the GO Station secondary plan. It also is a bit of a hybrid from the prestige industrial zone. So what we did was we tried to combine the uses, but really to conform to the secondary plan. So it is really looking at the uses that were in the secondary plan and using that zone to take that into account. I don't want to necessarily defer, but I might ask Matt to provide a bit more clarity.
Thank you, Mr. Bender. Matt, did you want to add to that, please?
Yeah, certainly, Mr. Chair. I think, yeah, a lot of the uses are the same. Typically with prestige industrial, it does provide for permission for some of those lighter uses. There's even things like personal service use, some retail, some hotel, motel uses. A lot of those are still carried forward in the office commercial use. I think it was more, the whole thing was identified in the GO secondary plan, that office commercial use, to, kind of understand and kind of to realize that, the nature of employment uses is shifting a little from the traditional, industrial type uses. Here we had a situation where we could still keep some of those uses, but as Mr. Bender said, kind of offer up a hybrid of maybe even some mixed use opportunity within there. So there are some uses that are added. There is a ratio of residential that's added, and it's site specific in terms of how that can be added, but there still are a lot of prestige industrial uses included in the office commercial use.
I appreciate it. I just noticed there was a lot of industrial sections that were reclassified as well to office commercial. And the concern I have is that whether or not those residents or those owners of those properties were notified or are aware of what's going on, that this change of use, granted, will continue so long as it's grandfathered, but down the road, should they go to sell, that use will not possibly, they would have to conform through a sale of land to the new office commercial. Is that correct?
Through you, Mr. Chair, it is, and they would have all been consulted as part of the secondary plan process. That was really when this big move was made. That was when everything was redesignated from an official plan standpoint to office commercial. They would have all been informed directly about that change, but really, the prestige industrial use, as I said, it's not the same as your traditional industrial uses, which have kind of a heavier manufacturing and kind of more of a distance separation requirement for them. Those heavier industrial uses, for the most part, are kind of, east and tucked in behind Ontario Street. You're talking about Christie and Union and places like that. But most of the prestige industrial here, the property owners were notified, and you're right, the uses can continue, but in most cases, the uses are permitted in the office commercial zone anyway.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Mikulik. Councillor Pachariva, please go ahead.
Thank you, Chair Brunet. Through you, and I'm gonna keep on the parking question, because that has come up time and time again. So to Mr. Bender, the 2016 Transportation Tomorrow survey that you spoke of in your report, who commissioned that, and what was the premise of that? So was that from straight census data, or what was the derivation of that, Mr. Bender?
Through you, Mr. Chair, to Councillor Pachariva, I'd have to actually double check. I didn't do the analysis myself, our transportation planners did, but I'm happy to take that back and give the information to staff so they could provide that to you.
Okay, because it was along the same lines as Councillor Russell's questions with the trend lines and that. And as a follow-up too, and I understand the premise of vehicle ownership, but the comparators that you used from out of Niagara and some within Niagara have transit systems. So like, we're going to have to update this based on the regional's official plan. So I'd like something in the interim, and if possible, like looking at places that are similar to us, looking at a Bracebridge or a Huntsville, and because they're similar size to us, they're similar makeup, and again, the use of cars. Because if we hear it time and time again, when someone does a there's a public meeting, it's planned, it's parking, right? There's not enough parking. There's not enough parking. So just if we could really drill down on that and get some specifics, I'd appreciate that. And my second question, Chair Brunet, I'm going to change the tact, and I'm going to look at the prohibiting of drive-throughs in the central business district. So knowing before in Beamsville, we had a chance to relocate a financial institution off of a problematic area to a different area, but they required a drive-through. So that wasn't allowed. So could this be more site specific going forward? So I guess that's to Mr. Bruder.
Matt?
Mr. Chair, I think just generally from a central business district point of view, you kind of want to retain that nice wall of general commercial and retail space with, maybe some residential on the ground floor. From the standpoint of site specific considerations, I think, when we say it's not allowed, I think that's another thing. If there was good rationale for it, maybe that's something that still would be a potential to come forward for a zoning bylaw amendment where council would have some decision-making authority on that too. Just typically from the standpoint of having drive-throughs in a central business district, it can add a little bit to congestion sometimes if it's a busy drive-through and things like that. And there's a little bit of, there's a pretty strong pedestrian contingent often in central business districts as well. But again, I think something from a site-specific standpoint, we could consider through a potential amendment, unless you want us to look a little bit further at potential properties where it could be something that we would want to permit as of right. I could take it away, but generally you wouldn't see that in a central business district. Okay,
well, I like, and I don't mean along the Main Street person. Well, you know what, I do. So, and it's not your typical drive-through. So Mississauga, on the way to my mother-in-law's house, there's a Starbucks, and the drive-through is in behind the building. So it's different, right? The relocation of that financial institution required a drive-through teller, but because we say thou shall not, it was an extension of the central business district that we pulled together. So do you know what I mean? In some cases where the ends justify the means to solve a problem, I think it should be looked at. So that would be my two questions, Chair Brunet, and I'll come back.
Thank you, Councillor Patrick. And before I go to Councillor Russell, Councillor Timmers. I'm just going to pivot to Mr. Deanny. Mr. Deanny, from an economic development lens, did you have anything to add there? Anything crossing your desk on drive-throughs in the CBD?
Thank you, Chair, and through you, Matt, Mr. Bruder or Director Bruder and I are in constant communication. And as of right now, I've had nothing come across my desk from a drive-through standpoint in the CBD, but if anything does come, Matt and I are in constant communication about that, Chair. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you. Councillor Timmers, please go ahead.
Thank you, Chair Brunet. Well, I think I'm like 10th in line, so most of my questions have been addressed. So I'm just going to make a couple of comments, if that's okay. I really appreciate the delegations tonight coming in, and tonight we are looking for input, and it's great discussion happening here. So I think when I was going through this again, which I've gone over it many times, I really do appreciate the illustrations. And I think what I'm looking for is some clear mapping or that shows like what exactly are the changes. Like I'm looking for the list of the changes that we're looking at here from 1995 to today. in this entire review. I think that would be very helpful. Some of the comments that were made this evening from the delegations, I think, were very, very good ones. The use of masonettes, to me, I had no idea what that is. Perhaps that could be removed. The idea of, trying to figure out what's joining beside each other zoning wise, and the mayor brought up the area where we're doing the heritage district study. What are those lands zoned? I personally would really like to see some kind of a map that is showing in great detail the zoning, because honestly, there's a lot there. So those are my comments, Mr. Chair. Thank you for letting me speak.
Thank you, Councillor Timmers. Deputy Clerk, I'm going to need some help here. I've got hands across my screen. I'm showing, I believe, Councillor Russell as the first one up. Is that correct?
That is correct. However, I do see Mr. Bruder's hand up to address Councillor Timmers' concerns or comments.
Go ahead, Mr. Bruder.
Thanks. Just quickly, Mr. Chair, thank you. I just wanted to comment on the visual perspective. I appreciate where you're coming from with the text. It can be hard to keep track of things. This is a comprehensive overhaul where essentially, we're producing a new zoning document. There'd be so many changes shown in a markup, even just in the way we lay it out, the tabular format now instead of text, some of the changes to the definitions. We can certainly look to mark up a lot of it for you moving forward. But I also wanted to point out that there are schedule maps too. They were shared as part of the notification materials that went out. They're on Speak Up Lincoln. They're pretty large file size and they're very site specific, but we'll definitely include those moving forward too as we get into the recommendation report when those are all finalized and we go through a consolidation with respect to some regional comments on those too. So you'll be seeing those as well. I just wanted to highlight that. That's all.
Thank you, Mr. Bruder. I think Councillor Timmers appreciates that as well as the rest of council. Councillor Russell, please go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Coming back in, so I'm going to go back to what Councillor Miklik had touched on with the Go Secondary plan. And I'm wondering if there's going to be any additional consultation with residents around there. And I've got a two-pronged question, both revolving around the zoning and height changes in the area north of Green Lane, south of the railway. So obviously we just went through a painful exercise with the development on the eastern side of these properties where the Go Secondary plan originally had a 6-story maximum height. And it went to 9 through the approval process. What's being proposed here is now a 10-story maximum height, which we've been told a few times that is a guideline, so there is the opportunity for it to go much higher. I'm just wondering if residents know about this and what the reaction will be when they do find out, and if we take it into consideration at all.
Mr. Bruder?
Yeah, through you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, this is one of those situations where it wasn't quite the same here in terms of, dialogue going on about a potential flexibility and increased heights. That 10 stories you're referring to is correct. It's on the west side of Ontario Street, right, just south of the tracks. No change there to that guideline. There's no height increases proposed as per this zoning bylaw. All the heights in there at the moment are in accordance with, other than the one that you just saw go through. That you're referring to, but everything else is in conformance with the height that was identified in the secondary plan. So it's more of a conformity exercise here, just updating the zoning so now that it aligns with the heights of the secondary plan. As a result, like we can reach out directly specific to those property owners just to let them know that's happening, but it's a little bit different because technically through the secondary plan, those heights have already been approved in terms of what's in our official plan. So it's more conforming to that official plan is what's happening here. So. But definitely open. Never a bad thing to provide any additional notification.
Okay, and through you, Mr. Chair, back to Mr. Bruder. I'm wondering if you could give your thoughts on what the impact of this could be on the property that's currently Sobeys. And the reason I asked that is, again, I remember I was part of one of the original Go Secondary focus groups back in 2017, 2018. And I remember being at a meeting where the town's consultant at the time drew 2 15-story buildings on that property as condos back then. And I'm wondering your thoughts on, again, with with some of the changes to that property, is there a likelihood that Sobeys somewhere down the line could be sold, knowing that the value of the property in terms of real estate is much higher than what it is as a grocery store? And what would the backup plan be for making sure our residents are serviced properly?
Through you, Mr. Chair. So we did, when we looked at some of the redevelopment options for this site specifically, I haven't heard anything about 2 15-story towers at all. There hasn't been anything brought forward to me, but we did look at the 10-story height required if there was any redevelopment happening. We did factor that in because that is one of the properties that has that 10-story permission in the secondary plan. From a servicing standpoint, we would have included that not only at the secondary plan level when that work was undertaken, but also, if you'll recall, we've done some additional infrastructure and traffic modeling, kind of more specific to the development proposals that we've recently been seeing, to update those numbers to make sure that we're still maintaining adequate service levels. So that would have been incorporated through that as well. But again, as I've said, 15 stories, really, if we were going to look at something like that, we would take the same approach we always do, with the fluidity of, provincial policy, with the fluidity of growth and where it's happening and by how much. Really what it comes down to is we would consider it in the same way we look at it in terms of, from a design standpoint, the compatibility with the adjacent properties on the other side. We would look at it, can the site handle what's being proposed from a variety of standpoints, and we would, go forward from there. But it would really, the devil would be in the details. But again, I haven't seen any such concepts. So right now, we've envisioned it at the secondary plan stage at the moment.
So just a point of clarification, Mr. Chair, on the same point.
Go ahead, Councillor. Go ahead.
So in terms of servicing, I didn't mean necessarily that lot being serviced. I meant in terms of food services. So where is there another opportunity in the town for a replacement of a grocery store? Should that property be developed somewhere down the road in terms of high intensity or high intensification?
Through you, Mr. Chair, I still kind of view this property as a suitable location for a grocery store. It's a good spot. It's pretty central. So, and it would be part of, sustaining that complete community. So I think any development concept we would be looking at, while there is a range of permitted uses in the general commercial zone that it would be in, we would still look to include provisions where a grocery store could be maintained. You see a lot of models, especially more recent ones, where a mixed use building could still include that grocery store on the ground level, and there could be some residential development potentially above it. That's something that we would definitely work towards. But I mean, from my perspective, I can tell you I'd be encouraging that location still to remain as a grocery store, as I think it's a suitable spot.
I do too, and I'm just wondering, is there any teeth that we have to make sure that is maintained?
Through you, Mr. Chair, typically, no, not through zoning at least, because you don't normally just provide one use, especially in a general commercial zone. There's typically a range. But again, that's something I can take away and further consider to see if there is any option that we can look at. But usually, yeah, there's a range of commercial or retail land uses that could be on a general commercial site. So that is definitely something I can take away and, update you on later on what I find.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Councillor. Deputy Mayor McPherson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and through you to Mr. Bruder. Matt, with regards to the Prudence Landing plan, when do you see in the process the opportunity for feedback interaction between the council and the developer? Prior to the recommendation report.
Through you, Mr. Chair, I think, one thing we can explore, obviously, we're going to be reaching out for some additional consultation. You mentioned specific, the Victoria Shores community, for example, would be a group that we would be consulting with further. I think after that, there might be perhaps a potential for an update to council, and there could be an opportunity at that point. But I think, working with our CAO and other members of staff, we can finalize how we're going to do that. But I think what I'm hearing is, you definitely want another opportunity and to have the developer available when we discuss this further. So that's a good thing to take away.
Thank you, Matt. Absolutely. We do need an opportunity to have feedback to the developer on on the plan for sure as a council. My second question is along the parking topic, and I will say that I get very nervous reducing any parking spots around town. So any reductions in current zoning for parking, I just question whether that's a smart thing to do. I guess, I am very much in sync with Councillor Russell in his line of questioning around change of demographics and change of the way people are living, especially over the last 3 or 4 years, in that, as we know, housing has just got so expensive that, if there is a demographic that, in a fairly significant way has been shut out from buying homes. So those folks are living with mom and dad, and those folks are working. So, I think there is the change, a significant change since 2016, that there is a potential for more cars in a driveway or in a garage. So I think that's a very important point that we need to really dig into. And, I think we could probably go door to door in the Fairview or the Fairgrounds area, in the Cache area, and get a pretty good idea of what kind of cars we're dealing with. And I think, if there's no survey available to help us, I think that would get us, a pretty good look at the information that we're looking for, because we know that townhomes are certainly a large part of the new build that's coming at us and that we're experiencing right now. So my question is, maybe through to Mr. Bender, when we look at the town of Lincoln, I think us well enough to know our geography and to know that we have some intensification corridors, if you will, and I wonder if it doesn't make sense, or maybe if you've seen different types of parking zoning across town, that you have a parking zone for a building that's 4 stories versus you have different parking for ground level housing. I wonder if you've seen that type of thing.
Mr. Chair, to Councilor McPherson. So in terms of having a varied approach in terms of how parking is to be required, depending on the built form. Yes, we've seen that before. I will say typically it's in areas that are more dense than say that of Beamsville or Lincoln in general. But yes, we've taken an overlay approach sometimes, where we would say in this area, due to the forecasted density, a different parking lens would be looked at in that particular area. So yeah, we've seen that before.
Okay. I don't know, if I can define how that would look for Lincoln, but I just think about, one size fits all across the entire town. And I wonder if that's the best way to go. So just those thoughts. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Benjima.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have a couple of questions. One is, if you look on page 85 of the zoning bylaw report, it speaks about garden suites. So it's 3.36, page 85. And my question is, I don't see anything in there about the requirement for a we said that sorry, I'm just trying to find that page I was just talking about. We said that a garden suite would not have a basement, and I don't see anything in there specific to that. So I'm asking, is this the place that we would put that requirement within this section of the zoning bylaw in the general provisions?
Mr. Chair, I'm not sure who the question is directed at, but I'm happy to respond. And if Matt has anything to fill in, he's welcome to do so. So through you, Mr. Chair, to Councillor, sure, we can certainly do that. I would want to check the definitions to see how a garden suite is defined, but certainly, if that's the direction we want to take, then certainly we can do that.
And if I could add to that, Mr. Chair, just further to that, I think there's some parts to be added in here further to the public meeting we had specific to the garden suites as well, right? So in terms of some of those provisions. So you'll see that in a later update as well, Councillor.
Okay. Thank you. I didn't actually look at the definitions that may be covered in there. That's a good point. And I have another question about, I think there may be some redundancy in that 3.36 section on temporary garden suites. If you can reread it, it talks several times about minimum size allowed by the Ontario Building Code. It's a small section, so I think there might be some redundancy. If you can reread it and have another look at it, please. And then another question, Mr. Chair. We had an item of correspondence from the owners of the Beacon stating that other municipalities have passed exceptions to the 2-year moratorium, which speaks to zoning amendments after the comprehensive zoning bylaw is passed. So my question, either through to the consultant or Mr. Bruder, is, are they referring to a blanket exception to the rule for all sites in Lincoln? And do we know of any specific examples of that happening? In the letter, it says that they can and will provide examples, but they don't. So I'm wondering if we know of any. Sorry, it was from, the letter was from MHBC on behalf of the Beacon. Yeah, go ahead. Thank you.
Yeah, sorry. Through you, Mr. Chair, I'll take that one. I think what they're asking is typically after you pass a new zoning bylaw, there's kind of a 2-year cooling off period where there's not supposed to be any zoning amendment applications that come in for that period of time. But if any one property owner that wants to come forward, if they've got a good reason that they want to bring forward for council consideration to kind of waive that 2-year freeze, they're able to do so. It wouldn't necessarily pertain to the entire town. It would be more specific to what they want to do. So it would be kind of considered case by council for anybody that's coming forward. Does that clarify?
It does. I'm aware that we have that option, or that an applicant has that option to apply for an exemption to that rule, that no changes be put in place within 2 years of the zoning amendment, with the zoning amendment being passed. But it seems like they're asking, and I could be reading it wrong, it seems like they're suggesting that some municipalities have said, just done away with the entire exemption, or done away with the entire requirement, or done away with the entire prohibition on any zoning amendments within 2 years for the entire municipality. That's what it seems like they're suggesting. So that's my question.
I'll follow up and make sure that wasn't their intention, but I don't believe that it was. But I can follow up with you separately just to be sure.
Okay, and maybe let them know that there is an opportunity to come forward on a site-specific basis and case-by-case basis. Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Sorry, thank you, Councillor. Mary Easton, please go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, through you to Mr. Bruder, and possibly to include the CAO. I'm looking for a demonstration through this document to minimize any surprises to the community on what's going to be required in the future in terms of the development of property. And by that, I am partially following on Councillor Timmer's observations, but also we need to be more specific about what's going to be required in order for us to meet our growth targets. I'm not looking at mapping that shows block schematics, but something much more granular than that. And in doing that, I believe that we could have more meaningful discussions with our community about what the zoning is going to be on these properties where more density and intensity would take place. And I think Mr. Leclerc is the only person that had a perspective mostly on prices, but also the value of walkable communities. And I don't want to put words in his mouth, but he was talking about smaller footprints for sure. We don't want boundary adjustments. And in order to avoid that, we need to make sure that we use the land that's available to us. So in areas where there is currently no development, Mr. Bruder, how can we lay out for our citizens what could potentially be developed in those areas, and what would that occupancy count look like, so that people have an idea of what the future is going to be like? Because we can't ignore the growth targets. That's not going to be permitted. We could spend a great deal of time in land tribunals to be turned away on day one because we haven't followed provincial policy. And I'm looking for something different than the normal way in which zoning bylaws are approved. We need much more granular discussion. How can we achieve that?
Mr. Bruder?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. That's a good question, and definitely something that I would say is difficult to attain. Reason being, again, I think what you're asking is, can we give the residents an idea about, okay, what realistically can they expect longer term on some of these properties? But really, some of the densities in the built forms that are going to be happening moving forward, it's not just, just because there's all this provincial direction, it will automatically go forward. I think there's a lot of site-specific circumstance that comes through more of a technical or feasibility design process, which is often done when a developer first makes a planning application. I was saying earlier, I think it was in response to some of Councillor Russell's questions, that when we look at where there is an increase in built form, if there's an increase in density over and above what was currently permitted as of right on the property, what we do is we look at that property, we look at the surrounding area, and we look at all the technical considerations from a built form perspective to an infrastructure perspective. And really, there is still a carrying capacity of what that land could carry in terms of additional density. Now, admittingly, we haven't done those exercises per se in all the vacant lands, but we do have a pretty good idea in some of our bigger ones. So maybe that is something moving forward that I can provide a little bit more direction on. But again, if our CAO has any further comment to make, I would turn to him.
Mr. Kirkopoulos?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I don't have anything considerably to add to Mr. Bruder's comments, but I think what we're hearing is both on the engagement side and I think on the planning side, we need to figure out a way to make sure our residents are, I think, more informed and more aware of what's going on. And so I think there's visual ways we can do that. There's engagement ways we can do that. We are doing it. And I think each and every time we're looking to find other ways to do that. But I think, to the mayor's comment around how are people going to know what's going on and how are we looking at vacant properties, I think we can share both information with council as well as with the public.
Mr. Chairman, just as a final observation, only 7% of the total land mass of Lincoln can be developed. And I'm wondering if this zoning bylaw isn't a good place to begin to interpret what that means to the public. I mean, I don't know what would be left, actually. If 7% is the total, I have no idea what would be left, but we certainly have a big job ahead of us to respond to the growth numbers. So I'll leave that with Mr. Bruder as well, and possibly we'll have some more discussion on that. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Councillor Mikulak.
Thank you, Chair Bernay, for another opportunity to speak and ask questions. I'm going to ask a little bit about enforcement with these bylaws, or with this new zoning bylaw. With regards to parking, so private parking lots, this winter in particular, we had a large amount of snow, tons of snow. And with snow comes a loss of parking. What, I don't know, do we have any teeth with our previous bylaw? Are we going to have any teeth with our new one in terms of enforcing private property owners to maintain the number of parking spaces they have provided?
Through you, Mr. Chair, that's a good question, Councillor. I think the answer to that would be yes. You know, we've kind of been going through a little bit of a transition generally. Now we've got a little bit more teeth in general that we can implement from a snow and snow removal standpoint, but I think it's something we would want to move forward to that. And I think there's further engagement with the community that can happen around it too, that, yeah, like it's the responsibility if we've got a private property owner, whether it be a condo owner, whether it be just a single residential dwelling owner, there is the onus on them to keep their parking spaces that are allotted to them open. So I think we do have some teeth in that regard, and I think we have to do a little bit more outreach to demonstrate that those teeth are there.
Okay, because I asked that question because, like, I look at the municipal parking lots and they're full now, and you know, they're getting better as the snow melts. But I compare it to, you know, a pile of dirt, you know, that's there temporarily, and you wouldn't have a pile of dirt on parking spaces where you lose parking spaces. So I want to make sure that there is something in this bylaw that is going to ensure that people are going to maintain those spots that seem to be precious as it is. And on continuing with enforcement, through you, Chair Bernay, with regards to zoning uses, you know, somebody's operating commercially on an agricultural property. You know, I take a drive down North Service Road and I see some, you know, a particular business that doesn't appear to be operating within that proper zoning classification. And it seems our current bylaw makes it difficult or challenging to enforce that. Are we going to be able to, moving forward in the future with this new draft, enforce that in a more speedier, expeditious manner?
Through you, Mr. Chair, I don't necessarily think that the existing bylaw prohibits us. I think by nature of some of these things where we've got, you know, land uses that might have been operating for quite some time, where the zoning really doesn't provide permission, it's a little bit of a tricky situation. There's kind of a balance to be attained here. We've got situations where these people sometimes, right or wrong, they've established their livelihood on this particular property. We need to work with them sometimes to maybe find another property to do their business on, or give them time to move. You have to be somewhat, I don't want to say accommodating, because ultimately there should be the enforcement piece if you can't reach a solution. But typically, if anything goes the distance with these types of issues, you have to show that you've been empathetic and you've done your diligence as much as you can in working with them. I can also tell you from strictly a bylaw officer perspective, they're not experts when it comes to land uses and zoning, so they don't typically drive around and look for a lot of these. The obvious ones they might, you know, they'll obviously see, they'll catch, but in some instances they might not be aware. But when there are complaints, we do coordinate with the property owners that are the source of the complaints, and we try to work out a solution. But I think what you're saying is sometimes the solution's a little bit more drawn out than you'd like. So I mean, that's something we can look to tighten up on moving forward. But some of these are a little bit complex to navigate and unfortunately do take time.
I respect that answer. I'm all about enforcing, and if, you know, with enforcement comes compliance, not just by that individual, by other individuals as well that may not be in compliance. And if we need to put something in our bylaw that stipulates a certain time frame where we're willing to be cooperative, then that's fine too. But at the same time, there has to be some sort of timeline for ultimate compliance. Otherwise, it's just an ongoing, never-ending concern. So those are my comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Pachariba.
Thank you, Chair Brunet. Just before I ask my two questions, and completely different, and no one has taken them, so I'm appreciative of that. I too would say we should take out the masonettes out of the RM1, but leave them in 2 and 3. So question to Mr. Bruder or Mr. Bender with respect to fencing. So Matt, we saw this we dealt with it at C of A. You and I have been going back and forth. So again, this is this broad brush, one size fits all, but when given elevation changes, should we have some flexibility?
I'll take this one, Mr. Chair.
Please do.
Really, I think this is another one of those situations where short answer is yes, probably. You saw with a recent example that ultimately we did get around to having that flexibility. There was a little bit of a process involved. In this case, a committee of adjustment decision. I know typically from a zoning perspective, I wouldn't want to, again, some zoning applies to, across a range of land uses and a range of different areas of town. Other than getting into site-specific circumstances that are permitted by a process, you wouldn't want to create a situation where you've got really high, fences everywhere. Sometimes that can lead to a segregated community a little bit. But, I think through our processes that we currently have in place, there's still, an opportunity to consider those site-specific circumstances. You mentioned topography and elevation. That's what we considered here for this specific example and why it was more appropriate. I know it's not ideal necessarily for the resident that might be seeking the relief, but ultimately, it gets kind of hard to pick where these areas are appropriate in terms of providing that flexibility. Sometimes it's best left to the applicant to be able to justify it. So those would be my comments. I think, staff are open to considering it on a site-specific nature.
So having said that, Matt, and I appreciate that because it was a process, but you know what? In the end, we got there. We all got there together, and it's all about compromise. So might that be, an item C, just for clarification again, so the residents know that there's an opportunity, right, based on topography and elevation, and that there's room for compromise.
Yeah, fair enough. Something we could look at.
Okay, and then through you, Chair Brunet, my question, food vehicles. So, we talk that bricks and mortar that pays taxes versus food vehicles. So having had done events, so would these be restricted to events? And having said that, as a follow-up, would there be a licensing process to try to level the playing field between a bricks and mortar establishment and this?
Through you, Mr. Chair, that's a good question about the licensing piece. Mr. Deanny and I and a few other members of staff were working on just licensing in general, looking to provide an update to council soon, but that's something we can take away. Maybe there is an avenue we can explore with that. But typically with the food vehicles, yes, they are associated with an event. They're more considered a temporary use most of the time than having them there all the time. So that's definitely a direction I think we're proceeding down.
Okay, terrific. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Russell, I'm really, really, really trying to avoid a third round of questions here, so make it quick.
Very, very quick question, Mr. Chair. Thank you very much for indulging me. Just something that the mayor had mentioned that triggered a question in my head. So she had mentioned that we only have in the town of Lincoln 7% developable land. And I know we do have a conversation coming up with the region about some of those targets. But I'm just wondering if I think it's important to keep in the context of this conversation for any residents that are still hanging on and watching this on YouTube. I'm wondering if Mr. Bruder can give some insight into how those numbers are derived. Is it completely given down to us? Is there a back and forth? I don't need to know the context of when are the numbers. I'm just wondering, just as far as delivery of the numbers go, is it straight top down to us? Nothing else.
Through you, Mr. Chair, no, not necessarily. Usually, or what has been the case is the region has looked to the local area municipalities to provide input. What kind of growth numbers are they experiencing? What are the market trends in that area? What can be expected moving forward? A lot of times when you're talking about, and we can talk further about this with that report you're mentioning, but when you talk about some of these growth projections that the region's including in their official plan, they then take that. So they're really acknowledging where significant amount of growth is currently happening, dictated by, the market, by migration patterns, by, from the GTA, what have you. And they utilize those forecasts to determine, what servicing levels are needed there, what type of investment in that municipality is going to be required moving forward. So a lot of the insight they request from the local area municipalities is, okay, guys, what are you seeing? What's happening? We engage in dialogue with them in that regard anyway. I mentioned some of the servicing modeling, the infrastructure modeling that we do, the traffic modeling. We're talking to them about all those anyway, but they really utilize that data and then further conversations with us to refine what their numbers, what the forecast should be. And then they, again, carry that forward in their master servicing plan so they can allocate investment that they're concluding that's required for the development that's being seen in that area.
Okay, so a point of clarification. So how much of our input went into creating these numbers? And I'm asking that because if these numbers are a target that we're being told we have to achieve, and yet at the same time, we're the ones that created the numbers to give to the region, I'm trying to figure out what starts and stops here.
Well, no, we, through you, Mr. Chair, we didn't just give them that number. What we do is we give them, we've marked up where development is happening, where it's recently happened and will be coming online. It's not yet online, where we've got development proposals proposed, what the densities are that are being proposed. They're over and above, you all know they're over and above some of the densities that have been permitted as of right. We do look at our secondary plans, what's permitted there. We look at all the densities that are identified to otherwise in our official plan in the medium and high density areas, those RM2 and RM3 zones, things like that. All these things factor into the number. We don't just give them a number and say, we think it's this. We give them all of that data and then they come forward with a number, and then, we engage in some dialogue on whether or not that number should be adjusted further based on any additional information that we might have received during the process, and they come up with a finalized number. So that's the back and forth that happens. It's really giving them a picture of what's actually happening real time in the municipality, and they go from there.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. So I'm not going to remove myself from the chair. I'm not going to ask any questions. I want to thank all the delegations this evening. I hopefully we have demonstrated in the almost 2 hours and 45 minutes that we take these public meetings very seriously. We do listen to the delegations, and I do believe that our staff will incorporate a lot of these questions and come back with further discussion before a recommendation report comes out. So I just want to echo that, I do think the information with regards to parking needs to be looked at in a more up-to-date fashion. We hear loud and clear, especially in Ward 2, that areas like Vista Ridge do not have enough parking. So reducing parking is going the wrong way in a lot of people's minds. So there being no further discussion of the presenters, I have a motion moved by Councillor Michalak. The council receive and file for information the presentation by Gregory Bender, WSP Global Inc., regarding the draft comprehensive zoning bylaw by the town of Lincoln, and that the council receive and file for information report PD 11-22 regarding the draft comprehensive zoning bylaw by the town of Lincoln, and that a recommendation report be prepared once all comments have been received and any identified issues have been addressed. I'm going to read that last bullet point again, that a recommendation report be prepared once all comments have been received and any identified issues have been addressed. I will now ask our deputy clerk to call out the vote.
Thank you, Chair. Councillor Timmers?
Yes.
Counselor Reimer,
Yes.
Counselor Regima,
Yes.
Counselor Russell,
Yes.
Counselor Pachariba,
Yes.
Counselor and Deputy Mayor McPherson,
Yes.
Counselor Micklick,
Yes.
Mayor Easton,
Support.
and Chair.
Yes.
Thank you. That carries.
Thank you, Deputy Clerk. Our second public meeting is for the purpose of the zoning bylaw amendment by Coles Florist, Inc. for 4766 Bartlett Road. We have 3 individuals that requested to be included in the public hearing. Please note delegations may speak for a maximum of 5 minutes. Once we have received the delegation, committee will transition directly into the report and the motion. And I do need to correct, I believe we are now down to 2 delegations. Is that correct, Deputy Clerk?
That is correct. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. So we have 2 delegations, 5 minutes. Committee will transition directly into the report and motion. Our first delegation for this item is Ethan Lamont of Upper Canada Consultants. Ethan, thank you for your patience. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good evening, Mayor, members of Council. My name is Ethan Lamont. I'm a junior planner here at Upper Canada Consultants. I'm with Dave DeVries, the owner. I just have a short PowerPoint presentation I'd like to give. Next slide, please. So the application is being made on behalf of Coles Floral, an established florist and garden center currently operating out of a property in the urban area in Grimsby. The business has expanded beyond the capacity of the existing facilities, and the owners have purchased the subject property with the intent of relocating the existing facilities to a more suitable agricultural location to accommodate the business's growth. This includes the construction of new greenhouses and production areas and associated parking and loading areas for growing and processing plants, and flowers that are sold to local landscape companies and florists. And a small on-site retail component is also proposed to allow for Coles to sell some of their products directly to the traveling public, which they currently do at their Grimsby location. The proposed operation is permitted under provincial, regional, and local land use plans, and the greenhouse and production areas are permitted as of right in the zoning bylaw. However, the town's official plan requires that site-specific zoning be implemented for on-farm diversified uses, which includes the proposed on-site retail component. The submitted zoning bylaw amendment therefore seeks to add a garden center as a permitted use on the property. All of the built form standards, so setbacks and height and lot coverage, are being maintained. Next slide, please. So here's an aerial image of the subject property, which is municipally addressed as 4766 Bartlett Road North. The property is irregularly shaped, 3.8 hectares or just over 9 acres in area. It has frontage on the North Service Road, Bartlett Road, and Lister Avenue to the north. The property is also visible from the QEW, as you can see in this image. And for locational context, it's located approximately across the highway from the town's municipal buildings and some other commercial industrial properties on the other side of the QEW. On the north side of the highway, the property abuts other agricultural lands, as well as some rural residential properties. The property was previously farmed and still contains some abandoned vineyards. However, it has not been cultivated for several years and is currently vacant. Next slide, please. So the next few slides are just some site photos. So here you can see the existing vineyards on the property. This is looking northwest from the service road. Next slide, please. You can see some of the surrounding residential properties in this image. So to the right of the screen, there's the property to the east, and then to the north. So further back in the image, the property to the north. Next slide, please. And this is a photo of some of the surrounding properties taken from Lister Road. Next slide, please. And this would be a contextual image of the surrounding area taken from Bartlett Road. Next slide, please. So in this image, you can see the proposed site plan. So the areas dedicated for the on-farm diversified component are shown highlighted in pink. As you can see, the retail component is quite small in comparison to the overall greenhouse operation. And this plan also demonstrates that the required amount of parking is being provided for both the retail component as well as the greenhouse operation component. The proposal is also subject to site plan approval, which allows town staff to review site and building design elements and to ensure the development is orderly and appropriate and doesn't negatively impact adjacent properties. Next slide, please. So from a land use planning perspective, the property is located in the Greenbelt Plan area and is designated as unique agricultural under the region's official plan and specialty agricultural under the town's official plan. The property is also zoned as agricultural. Agricultural uses, including greenhouses, are intended to be the predominant use of unique and specialty agricultural lands. On-farm diversified uses, which includes the proposed on-site retail component, are also permitted, provided that they are secondary to the primary agricultural use, and that site-specific zoning is implemented to permit their use, which is why we're in front of you this evening with this application. The property is well connected to the town's transportation network, as it is located near the highway and has frontage on 3 public roadways. A traffic impact study was prepared, which concludes that there will be no negative impact on the existing traffic network from the proposed operation. Since the property is located outside of the urban area, there's no municipal services, so private services are required for the proposal, which are to be further refined through the site plan process. As you can see in the previous site photos, the property contains some abandoned vines, but has not been actively cultivated for several years. So the application would establish a new agricultural use for a vacant agricultural parcel. Overall, the property is a permitted, appropriate, and suitable location for the proposed development. Next slide, please. So this public meeting is part of an ongoing planning process. So we had an open house a couple of weeks ago on the 15th of February, which was attended by the neighbor to the north. At that point in time, the neighbor voiced some concerns with some things that had happened with the previous owner of the property. Since then, Dave has had a chance to meet with the owner and has alleviated some of his concerns and is going to be working with the owner throughout the site plan process to make sure that all of their concerns are alleviated. Following tonight's public meeting, the application will come back to council for a final decision, likely in spring. After which time the site plan approval process will commence. So I'm going to end my presentation there. Thank you for your time, and I'll be happy to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you, Ethan, and thank you for keeping it within the 5-minute allotment. Thank you. So I want to remind committee members that we will be going directly transitioning into the report, but are there any clarifying questions to the delegate from his presentation? Seeing none, Deputy. Councillor Michalak.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Through you to the delegation, to the presenter. With regards to the retail aspect and where consumers can go within this greenhouse, are they going to be is the retail store strictly going to be that area identified as the retail store, or will people be able to walk through the greenhouse and shop through the greenhouse as well?
I can field that one. So through you, Mr. Chair, to Councillor Mikola. Yes, consumers will be able to pick up plants throughout the greenhouse. It is those retail areas will be more for things like fertilizer and fungicides and plant health things to help people with their shrubs and trees at their homes. Possibly some garden decor items, but we do plan on having a consumer be able to pick up their geranium or their hanging basket that's growing in the greenhouse.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Rinchema.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and through the presenter, thank you for your presentation. My question is about the orientation of the building as it's shown. I'm wondering if you had considered, it seems like a shame that the front of the building won't be facing the QEW. It doesn't, the entrance will be facing east. I correct me if I'm wrong, but I picture it would just be a lot more, you'd have a lot more exposure on the QEW if you could see the front of a nice building. Maybe you did consider this and then it just, it didn't work for some reason. And I'm sure you have plans for some good signage that will really make it clear what's going to be happening on the property. But did you consider orienting the retail component to face the QEW?
So I will also field this one. So the entrance and the front of the building is facing the QEW. So what you're seeing on the east side of the building would be more of a service entrance for employees for receiving materials. We will be refining this plan a little bit through the site plan process, but the entrances will be on the south side of the building and greenhouse. So it will be very visible and have good sight lines and visually appealing to the highway as well.
I see that now. Thank you. That's good. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Mayor Easton.
Thanks very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much for your presentation. I have a couple of questions. And so I'm pleased to hear that the orientation to face the Queen Elizabeth Way is accurate. But I'm also wondering what the company has, what Coles has in mind in terms of possibly the unique properties of what that side of the building is going to look at. You've got a pretty unique property in Grimsby. It certainly has a lot of curb appeal. How do you plan to duplicate, not the same, of course, but how do you plan to duplicate that curb appeal in this location?
Through you, Mr. Chair, to Madam Mayor. So we plan on building a bit of a facade on the front of our greenhouse so it doesn't look like your traditional greenhouse as you drive along the QEW, and we want it to look a little bit more special compared to Westbrook or Hendricks. So we have plans to do some powder coating on the front of our greenhouse so it looks a little bit more conservatory-like. Some brickwork on the bottom of the greenhouse just to give it to curb appeal, and also try to bring in the heritage of our business. Our business was established in 1891. Our family has owned it since 1986, so we want to also bring in that aspect when we're thinking about the landscape and how that greenhouse looks from the road.
That's great. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I don't want to overstep my two questions, but I have a question about overburden, and I have a question about the potential for any deliveries to require gravitating off-site and parking on the road. I'm going to assume that that's not the kind of activity that we have going on here, but I'm just checking because I don't want there to be any surprises in the neighborhood. Would there be any reasons for there to be many trucks lined up on the road waiting to either bring things in or to take things away?
Through Mr. Chair, the question, it wouldn't be quite that scale of a greenhouse. There's quite a bit of room on the site to accommodate any deliveries. There's quite a big gravel area as well. So there wouldn't necessarily be any concerns with on-street parking for any of the delivery vehicles.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, the handling of overburden and the processing for preparing the site, I'm not sure I don't know who governs greenhouses in terms of those things, but I know that they are quite important. Could I seek your guidance on where I would be able to get the answer to that question?
Mr. Bruder, did you want to take a shot at that?
Yeah, certainly, Mr. Chair. I believe some of that is looked after by OMAPRA, but that's something I can follow up with you after, Your Worship, and look into that further for you.
That's great. Thank you very much. Thank you.
you,
Thanks very
ma'am.
much to the presenters. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I'm not seeing any more questions for this delegation. I do want to make a comment that I do appreciate. I was not able to take in the open house, but I do believe, or I do appreciate the comments that the Coles representatives are willing to meet with the neighbor and try to alleviate those concerns. So I wanted to make mention of that. That's greatly appreciated. Our next delegation is Jeff King. Jeff, please go ahead.
Hello?
Yes, Jeff, we can hear you.
Yeah, we happen to be the neighbor to the north. Had a great meeting with Dave. We're just kind of staying in touch with the process, and we don't have any questions or concerns at this time.
That's great. Thank you for joining us tonight as a delegation and echoing that those conversations are going well. Thank you so much. There being no further delegations and information for consideration to this item, I now declare this public meeting to address the zoning bylaw amendment by Coles Florist Inc. for 4766 Bartlett Road North adjourned. I have a motion moved by Councillor Rinjima that council receive and file as information the following delegations regarding item 5.2, zoning bylaw amendment by Coles Florist Inc. for 4766 Bartlett Road North, Ethan Lamont and Jeff King. I will now ask the deputy clerk to call out the vote.
Thank you, Chair. Mayor Easton?
Support.
Councillor Regima?
Yes.
Councillor Russell?
Yes.
Councillor Patriva?
Yes.
Councillor and Deputy Mayor McPherson?
Yes.
Councillor Micklick?
Yes.
Councillor Reimer?
Yes.
Councillor Timmers?
Yes.
And Chair.
Yes.
Thank you. That carries.
Thank you, Deputy Clerk. We will now move directly into report PD-09-22 regarding the zoning bylaw amendment by Coles Florist Inc. for 4766 Bartlett Road North. Do members of council have any questions? Councillor Mikulak.
Thank you very much, Chair Brene. Through you to Mr. Bruder, from a planning perspective, like, is there any concern about the amount of retail space? What is retail? What is what percentage of the building? What percentage of this is accessible to the consumer? Like, is the whole structure retail? What's the property tax classification moving forward in the future of this proposal?
Through you, Mr. Chair, there's really no concern from a land use perspective. We looked at the area for the retail establishment, that being the 344 square meters, the unfarmed diversified piece. We consulted with the region on how the calculation was concluded, and really, you know, from the consent, or from the point of having potential consumers walking around the greenhouses to pick plants, at the end of the day, they're still being used for an agricultural use. They're still being used to grow the plants. And I don't think necessarily, and at least it's my understanding, that not all of the greenhouse space would be for that. There's probably different stages of growing in different areas of the greenhouse. But, you know, the fact that a consumer just walks through and picks out the plant and then brings it to the retail area, that doesn't count to me as an extension of the retail space, because there still is an active agricultural use going on there, and that is growth within the greenhouse. So from a planning perspective, currently I don't see any issues in terms of how the on-farm diversified calculation came to be.
Thank you very much.
Deputy Clerk, I'm not seeing any hands. Anything else in the queue?
No, you are good to go.
Thank you. There being no further discussion, I have a motion moved by Councillor Russell. The council approve for information report PD-09-22 regarding the zoning bylaw amendment by Upper Canada Consultants on behalf of Coles Florist Inc., and that a recommendation report be prepared once all comments have been received and any identified issues have been addressed. And I will now ask Deputy Clerk to call out the vote.
Thanks, Chair. Councillor Reimer?
Yes.
Councillor Micklick?
Yes.
Councillor and Deputy Mayor McPherson?
Yes.
Councillor Regima?
Yes.
Councillor Russell?
Yes.
Councillor Patriva?
Yes.
Councillor Timmers?
Yes.
Mayor Easton?
Support.
Chair?
Yes.
Chair? Thank you, that carries.
We have now concluded the statutory public meeting section of the agenda and will now continue to the consent agenda. We are now considering item 6. Do we have anyone that's interested in pulling anything from the agenda? I'm not seeing anything. So we are now considering item 6, the consent agenda, inclusive of item 6.1, Housing and Homelessness Community Partnership Advisory Committee minutes of January 11th, 2021. Item 6.2, Municipal Heritage Advisory Committee minutes of January 13th, 2022. And item 6.3, Museum Advisory Committee members of January 20th, 2022. We will require, do we have a mover, Madam Deputy Clerk? Do we have a mover here on this?
Thank you, Chair. And through you, it's Councillor McPherson.
Councillor McPherson. A motion moved by Councillor McPherson. The council receive and file for information the account consent agenda inclusive of item 6.1, Housing and Homelessness Community Partnership Advisory Committee minutes of January 11th, 2021. Item 6.2, Municipal Heritage Advisory Committee minutes of January 13th, 2022. And item 6.3, Museum Advisory Committee minutes of January 2022. Just looking at 6.1, is that a typo? Should that be 2022 instead of 2021?
You were right. Thank you.
Okay. I will now ask our Deputy Clerk to call out the vote.
Thank you, Chair. And I just noticed Mayor Easton put her hand up.
Mr. Chairman, on my agenda, I have an item 6.4, active transportation.
Through you, Chair, that was removed from the agenda as the Active Transportation Advisory Committee did not have their meeting last week in order to approve those minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Clerk. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay.
Are you okay with me calling the motion, Chair?
Absolutely. Please do.
Thank you. And with that, Councillor and Deputy Mayor McPherson?
Yes.
Councillor Micklick?
Yes.
Councillor Regima?
Yes.
Councillor Russell?
Yes.
Mayor Easton?
Support.
Councillor Timmers?
Yes.
Councillor Reimer?
Yes.
Councillor Patriva?
Yes.
And Chair?
Yes.
Thank you. That carries.
So we are now at item number 7, the Planning and Economic Development Committee agenda. I'm looking at the clock. I realize we are going into a presentation. Do we need to proceed, or do we need a biological break? I'm just looking. Everyone is saying they're looking for a biological break. Okay, can we be back at